The sand is red. Not the pale gold of a desert at dawn, not the amber shimmer that travel photographers capture from helicopter doors. This sand is red because it is soaked in blood, his blood, and the man lying face down in it does not yet understand that he is dying. The ringing in his ears is so total, so absolute, that it has replaced the world. There is no sky, there is no horizon, there is only the high-pitched scream of ruptured eardrums and the strange, almost peaceful sensation of warmth spreading across his chest. He tries to breathe, and something inside him shifts, something sharp, something metallic, something that does not belong in human flesh. His fingers claw at the dirt, his mouth fills with copper, and somewhere impossibly far away he hears shouting, frantic, guttural, a language he does not speak, and the dull crunch of boots on gravel moving toward him. Tony Stark, billionaire, genius, the man whose name is printed on the side of every missile in "This valley is bleeding out in the same dirt where his weapons land." 37 seconds ago he was laughing. He had a drink in his hand, scotch, neat. Because even in a war zone, Tony Stark does not compromise on his vices, and he was cracking a joke to a convoy of young soldiers who looked at him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for rock stars and professional athletes. The Jericho missile demonstration had gone flawlessly. The mountainside had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a plume of fire and debris that rose like the fist of an angry god, and Tony had turned to the cameras with that grin, that insufferable, magnetic billion-dollar grin, and spread his arms wide as if to say, "You're welcome." The soldiers laughed, the generals nodded, and for one shining, arrogant moment Anthony Edward Stark was exactly what the world believed him to be, untouchable. Then the first rocket hit the lead Humvee. The explosion tore the vehicle apart like wet paper, flipping the burning chassis end over end in a somersault of fire and shredded steel. The second rocket came half a heartbeat later, detonating against the road itself, sending a geyser of rock and shrapnel skyward. Soldiers screamed. Gunfire erupted from the ridgeline, muzzle flashes winking like malevolent stars against the brown hills. Tony was thrown from the vehicle before he could process what was happening, his body ragdolling through the air, his drink still arcing from his hand in a surreal slow-motion spiral, and then he hit the ground and the world cracked apart. He crawled. That is the detail that matters. Tony Stark, who had not crawled since infancy, who had been carried by limousines and private jets, and the sheer gravitational pull of his own wealth, dragged himself across blood-soaked sand with the desperate animal instinct of a creature that does not want to die. He reached for his phone, shattered. He reached for a weapon, there was none, and then he saw. It, a Stark Industries shell, half buried in the dirt not 10 feet from his face, its casing stamped with the name he had inherited, the name he had worn like a crown. The letters were clear even through the dust and the blood. S-T-A-R-K. His own name, printed on the instrument of his destruction. The shell detonated. Shrapnel, tiny, jagged shards of metal forged in his own factories, designed by his own engineers, approved by his own signature, tore through his chest and began its slow, inexorable journey toward his heart. The world went white, then black, then nothing at all. To understand the man who woke up in that cave with a car battery wired to his chest, you must first understand the empire that built him and the ghosts that haunt its foundations. The Stark legacy begins not with Tony but with Howard Anthony Walter Stark, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his capacity for emotional distance. Born in the early 20th century on the Lower East Side, of New York to immigrant parents who worked themselves to the bone, Howard Stark possessed the kind of restless volcanic intelligence that refuses to be contained by circumstance. By his 20s, he had already founded Stark Industries, a small but ambitious engineering firm that caught the attention of the United States military during the Second World War. Howard did not merely contribute to the war effort, he helped define it. He worked alongside the Strategic Scientific Reserve, the clandestine agency responsible for Project Rebirth, the super soldier program that transformed a frail kid from Brooklyn named Steve Rogers into Captain America. Howard built the vibranium shield. Howard flew the plane. Howard was there in the smoke and the chaos and the impossible dawn of the superhuman age, laying the groundwork for a future he would never fully see. After the war, Howard Stark became something more than an industrialist. He became an architect of the modern world. Stark. Industries expanded with breathtaking speed, its contracts spanning military defense, aerospace, nuclear energy, and advanced computing. Howard's genius was protean. He could design a missile guidance system in the morning and sketch the blueprints for a revolutionary arc reactor prototype by afternoon. He co-founded SHIELD, the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division, alongside Colonel Chester Phillips and the legendary Peggy Carter, embedding himself into the very infrastructure of global security. His name became synonymous with American innovation, with progress, with power. But behind the magazine covers and the government commendations, behind the gleaming towers and the roaring factories, Howard Stark was a man at war with himself. He drank too much. He worked too late. He carried the weight of secrets that no single human being should bear. Secrets about super soldier serums and alien technologies and the fragile, terrifying truth that the world was far more dangerous than anyone in it wanted to believe. And when his son was born, Anthony Edward Stark, on the 29th of May, 1970, Howard looked at the boy and saw not a child to be cherished, but a legacy to be forged. Tony's childhood was gilded and hollow. The Stark mansion was a cathedral of wealth, marble floors, priceless art, rooms so vast a small boy's voice would echo back to him like a ghost's. Maria Stark, Tony's mother, was the warmth in that cold palace. She was gentle where Howard was severe, present where Howard was absent, and she loved her son with a fierce, quiet devotion that Tony would spend the rest of his life trying to live up to. Maria read to him. Maria held him when the nightmares came. Maria was the one who noticed when the boy, barely 4 years old, disassembled the family's stereo system and rebuilt it with improved circuitry. She did not scold him. She smiled and called Howard, and for one rare, precious moment, father and son shared something that looked almost like pride. But those moments were eclipsed by absence. Howard was always travelling, Washington, Moscow, secret facilities in deserts and mountains and places that did not appear on any map. When he was home, he was distracted, demanding, measuring his son against standards no child could meet. Tony built his first circuit board at age 4. He built his first engine at 6. By the time he was 8, he was solving equations that baffled his private tutors. None of it was enough. Howard wanted more. Howard always wanted more. And so Tony learned the lesson that would define his life. Love is conditional, approval must be earned, and the only reliable companion is your own mind. At 15, Tony enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the youngest student in the institution's history at that time. He graduated summa cum laude with dual degrees in electrical engineering and physics before he was old enough to legally drink. His professors described him as the most naturally gifted intellect they had ever encountered. His classmates described him as arrogant, reckless, and impossible to like. Both descriptions were accurate. Tony Stark at 17 was a supernova of raw talent and unchecked ego, a young man who could see the architecture of the universe in his mind's eye, but could not maintain a single meaningful human relationship. He drank, he partied, he burned through friendships and romances with the careless efficiency of a man who believed that people, unlike machines, were fundamentally unreliable. And then, on the 15th of December 1991, the phone rang. Howard and Maria Stark were dead. A car accident on a lonely stretch of Long Island Highway. That was the official story. The version that appeared in newspapers and evening broadcasts. The version that Tony would believe for years before the truth clawed its way to the surface. The reality buried beneath. Layers of classified intelligence and Cold War paranoia was far worse. But on that December night, all Tony knew was that the two people who had shaped him, one through love, one through the aching absence of it, were gone. He was 21 years old, he was alone, and he was the sole heir to one of the largest and most powerful corporations on the face of the earth. Tony Stark inherited Stark Industries and promptly did exactly what you would expect a grieving, brilliant, emotionally stunted 21-year-old to do with limitless wealth and zero oversight. He set the world on fire. Not literally, though that would come later, but with the reckless, incandescent energy of a man running from something he could not name. He became the face of Stark Industries not as a somber steward of his father's legacy, but as a showman, a provocateur, a man who sold weapons with a martini in one hand and a supermodel on the other. The media loved him. The military loved him. Governments lined up with checkbooks open, and Tony Stark, the Merchant of Death, as one journalist would later christen him, was happy to oblige. The weapons grew more sophisticated. The contracts grew larger. The body counts, half a world away in conflicts Tony would never see, grew longer. But numbers on a spreadsheet are abstract things, easy to ignore when you're standing in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, when the champagne is cold and the music is loud and the entire world seems to exist solely for your amusement. Tony did not think about the children in villages where his cluster munitions fell. He did not think about the soldiers, on both sides, shredded by his fragmentation shells. He did not think, because thinking would have required feeling, and feeling was the one thing Tony Stark had spent his entire life engineering himself not to do. Obadiah Stane made it easy. Stane, Howard's old business partner, a towering, bald, avuncular figure who had stepped in as Tony's mentor after Howard's death, ran the day-to-day operations with a steady, reassuring hand. He called Tony "my boy." He clapped him on the shoulder. He shielded him from the uglier realities of the arms trade while quietly, methodically expanding Stark Industries' reach into every conflict zone on the planet. Tony trusted him. Tony trusted him because Obadiah was the closest thing to a father he had left, and because trusting Obadiah meant not having to look too closely at the empire he had inherited. And so the years passed. Tony Stark grew richer, more famous, more isolated behind walls of technology and hedonism. He dated women whose names he forgot by morning. He drank scotch that cost more per bottle than most families earned in a month. He designed weapons that could level city blocks and called it progress. He was, by every metric the world offered, a success. He was also, by every metric that mattered, completely and utterly lost. Which brings us back to the desert, back to the blood-soaked sand, back to the moment when the shrapnel from a Stark Industries shell entered his chest and began its slow migration toward the organ that Tony Stark had spent 30 years pretending he did not possess. He woke in darkness. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and machine oil, and something medicinal he could not identify. His chest ached, not the dull ache of a bruise, but a deep, structural agony, as if something fundamental had been rearranged inside him. He looked down and saw wires, cables, a crude electromagnet strapped to his sternum, connected by a tangle of leads to a car battery sitting on the dirt floor beside his cot. He did not scream. He wanted to. The scream was there, building in his throat like a wave, but the man sitting across from him spoke first. "I would not remove that if I were you." Ho Yinsen, thin, bespectacled, calm with the practiced serenity of a man who has already made peace with his own death. Physicist, a surgeon, a prisoner like Tony, of the terrorist organization known as the Ten Rings. Yinsen had saved Tony's life, opening his chest in a cave with salvaged surgical tools, extracting as much shrapnel as he could, and rigging the electromagnet to keep the remaining fragments from reaching his heart. The car battery was the only thing standing between Tony Stark and cardiac arrest. It was primitive. It was desperate. It was, in its crude and terrible way, the first piece of technology Tony Stark had ever worn that was designed not to kill, but to keep alive. The Ten Rings leader, a brutal warlord named Raza, appeared with an ultimatum that carried the weight of absolute certainty. Build us the Jericho missile or die. He showed Tony the stockpile, crates upon crates of weapons, every one of them stamped with the Stark Industries logo, sold through channels that should not have existed, funneled to terrorists by hands Tony had never thought to question. His own weapons, his own legacy. Stacked in a cave and pointed at the world, Tony said yes, then he lied. What followed was a masterwork of deception. Working alongside Yinsen in the dim, flickering light of that cave, Tony did not build a missile. He built something else entirely. First, the miniaturized arc reactor, a feat of engineering that should have been impossible with the materials available, a glowing disk of clean energy that replaced the car battery and kept his heart beating with a soft, steady hum of blue light. It was beautiful. It was unprecedented. And it was merely the power source for what came next. The armor, piece by piece, welded from salvaged missile parts and scrap metal, hidden in plain sight under the guise of weapons construction. It was crude, grey, hulking, medieval in its silhouette, more war machine than superhero suit, but it was brilliant. Repulsor technology in the gauntlets, rudimentary flight capability in the boots, enough firepower to level the cave and everything in it. Tony built it with burned hands and sleepless nights, with Yinsen by his side translating, distracting their captors, buying time with the quiet courage of a man who knows exactly what his sacrifice will cost. The day came. The 10 rings grew suspicious. The timetable accelerated, and Yinsen, gentle, brilliant, doomed Yinsen, looked Tony in the eye and did the bravest thing anyone had ever done for him. He grabbed a weapon and ran into the corridor, firing wildly, drawing the guards away from Tony, buying the final minutes needed for the armor to power up. By the time Tony found him, Yinsen was slumped against a wall of sandbags, his shirt dark with blood, his breathing shallow and fading. "Don't waste it," Yinsen whispered. "Don't waste your life." Tony held him. The billionaire, the playboy, the merchant of death. He knelt in the dirt of a cave on the other side of the world and held a dying man who'd given everything so that Tony Stark might have the chance to become something more than what he was. Yinsen smiled. Yinsen closed his eyes. And then he was gone, and Tony was alone with the weight of a debt that could never be repaid. What emerged from that cave was not Tony Stark. Not entirely. The grey armour smashed through the entrance in a storm of fire and fury, repulsors blazing, scattering the 10 rings fighters like leaves in a hurricane. Tony burned the weapons, every crate, every missile, every shell bearing his name. He incinerated them all, walking through the flames like a figure from myth, an iron golem born of guilt and grief and the desperate, furious need to undo what he had done. The suit's flight system barely held. He crashed in the desert miles away, the armour shattering around him on impact, leaving him half buried in sand with the arc reactor still glowing in his chest like a small blue star. The military found him hours later. Rhodey, James Rhodes, Lieutenant Colonel, the one friend Tony had not managed to drive away, was the first face he saw. Rhodey ran across the sand and dropped to his knees and held Tony the way you hold something you thought was lost forever. Tony, bruised and broken and reborn in ways that neither of them yet understood, looked at his oldest friend and said the words that would change everything. "I know what I have to do." The press conference was chaos. Reporters packed into the Stark Industries atrium expecting the usual platitudes. A kidnapping survivor expressing gratitude. A corporation assuring shareholders that business would continue as usual. Instead, Tony Stark stood at that podium, arc reactor humming beneath his shirt, and detonated a bomb far more powerful than anything his factories had ever produced. "I have seen firsthand the devastation caused by the weapons I created. Effective immediately, Stark Industries will cease all weapons manufacturing." The room erupted. Cameras flashed, Obadiah Stane's face visible for just a moment. Behind the curtain of advisors and publicists went absolutely white. And Tony Stark, for the first time in his life, told the truth. Not to sell something, not to charm someone, not to deflect or distract or perform, but because a man named Ho Yinsen had died in a cave so that Tony could stand here and say it. The Merchant of Death was dead. Something else was being forged. The penthouse workshop beneath Tony Stark's Malibu mansion had always been a playground. Before the cave, it was where Tony tinkered between cocktail parties, a sprawling cathedral of chrome and glass perched on a cliff above the Pacific, stocked with vintage cars, holographic design interfaces and enough computing power to rival most government agencies. It was a rich man's hobby room, a monument to genius without purpose. But the man who descended those stairs after the press conference was not the man who had left. The cars gathered dust. The bar went untouched. The holographic displays, once used to model next-generation missile guidance systems, now projected something entirely different. The skeletal wireframe of a suit of armour that would change the world. Tony worked with a fury that bordered on mania. He had not slept properly since the cave. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Yinsen's face, heard the whisper of that final command echoing through the corridors of his mind like a prayer he could not yet answer. The arc reactor in his chest hummed its constant reminder. You are alive because someone died for you. The crude grey armour from the cave had proven the concept, but it was a blunt instrument, a thing of desperation and scrap metal. What Tony envisioned now was something refined, something worthy of the sacrifice that had birthed it. He called the original suit Mark I. The next iteration would be Mark II. The engineering challenges were staggering, even for a mind like Tony's. Flight stabilization alone consumed weeks of trial and error, the kind of spectacular, bone-jarring, furniture-destroying error that left scorch marks on the ceiling and dents in the workshop floor. Tony's artificial intelligence assistant, JARVIS, just a rather very intelligent system, a dry, British-accented program Tony had built years earlier and named in honour of his family's longtime butler, Edwin Jarvis, became his co-pilot in this endeavour, running calculations, monitoring structural integrity, and offering wry observations as Tony launched himself into walls at increasingly ambitious velocities. The relationship between man and machine was evolving, the AI serving not merely as a tool but as a companion, a voice in the void of Tony's self-imposed isolation. The Mark II took shape over weeks of relentless iteration. Sleeker than the cave armour by orders of magnitude, it was a full-body suit of silver alloy, equipped with repulsor technology in both gauntlets and boot-mounted jet propulsion capable of sustained flight. Tony tested it on a freezing night above the Pacific, climbing higher and higher, the Malibu coastline shrinking to a ribbon of light beneath him, the stars growing close enough to touch. For one breathless, transcendent moment, he was free. Truly, completely free. Untethered from gravity, from guilt, from the crushing weight of the name he carried. Then the suit iced over at high altitude. The repulsors failed. Tony plummeted toward the ocean in a screaming, spinning freefall, managing to restart the systems barely 100 feet above the water, pulling up so hard the G-forces nearly knocked him unconscious. He crashed through his own roof. JARVIS noted the damage with characteristic understatement. Tony, lying on his back amid shattered glass and twisted metal, laughed for the first time since the desert. The icing problem was solved with a gold titanium alloy, inspired in a moment of accidental brilliance by the colour scheme of a vintage hot rod in the workshop. Mark III was born, in red and gold, and it was magnificent. Lighter, stronger, and more agile than anything that had come before, it incorporated lessons from every failure, improved flight stabilization, a heads-up display linked directly to JARVIS, repulsor beams calibrated for both propulsion and offensive capability, and a structural integrity that could withstand small arms fire and high-velocity impacts. It was not just armour. It was an extension of Tony's will, a second skin forged from genius and grief, gleaming like a promise kept. But building the suit was only half the battle. The other half was navigating the wreckage of the world Tony had left behind. Stark Industries was in freefall. The stock price had cratered the moment Tony announced the end of weapons manufacturing, and the boardroom had erupted into open warfare. Shareholders demanded answers. Military contracts, worth billions, were suspended pending review. And at the centre of the storm stood Obadiah Stane, his broad face, arranged in an expression of fatherly concern that concealed something far colder. Stane had spent decades building Stark Industries into the most profitable weapons manufacturer on the planet. Tony's abrupt moral awakening was not merely inconvenient, it was an existential threat to everything Stane had constructed. Behind closed doors, Stane filed injunctions, courted board members, and quietly began manoeuvring to have Tony removed from his own company. To Tony's face, he remained the same avuncular mentor he had always been, reassuring, supportive, patient. The mask would not slip for some time yet. Meanwhile, Tony had a more immediate problem. The 10 rings had not disappeared with his escape. His weapons, the ones he had not burned, were still out there, in the hands of warlords and terrorists, being used to subjugate villages and massacre innocents in the same region where Yinsen had died. Tony saw the news footage on a workshop monitor late one night. A village called Gulmira, Yinsen's home, under siege by the very organisation that had held them captive. Men with Stark Industries rifles executing civilians in the street. Families fleeing through rubble. Children screaming. Tony suited up. The flight to Gulmira was long and silent. Nothing but the rush of wind and the hum of the arc reactor, and the cold, crystalline focus of a man who has found, perhaps for the first time, a purpose that is not for sale. He arrived like a thunderbolt. The Mark III armour descended on the Ten Rings encampment with the precision of a surgical strike and the fury of a natural disaster. Repulsor blasts tore through weapons caches. Armoured fists shattered concrete barricades. Tony moved through the compound like a spectre of vengeance, targeting only the armed fighters, shielding civilians with his own body, dismantling the machinery of terror piece by piece. The soldiers fired everything they had: rifles, rockets, mounted machine guns, and the rounds sparked and ricocheted off the red and gold armour like rain off a cathedral roof. When it was over, the compound was rubble, the weapons were ash, and the people of Gulmira stood blinking in the sudden silence, staring at the armoured figure hovering above them, like something out of a myth they had forgotten how to believe. Tony did not stay. He rocketed skyward and vanished into the clouds, leaving behind only scorch marks and freedom. But the world had noticed. The United States Air Force scrambled fighter jets to intercept the unidentified flying object that had just conducted an unauthorized military operation in sovereign airspace. Tony, still learning the limits of his own suit, found himself dodging heat-seeking missiles at Mach 2, the desert blurring beneath him in a smear of brown and gold. It was Rhodey who saved him, not with weapons, but with a phone call, talking Tony through the crisis while simultaneously lying through his teeth to his own commanding officers. Their friendship, already tested by Tony's erratic behaviour since the kidnapping, was now entangled in a web of secrets that would only grow more complex. Rhodey knew something had changed in Tony. He did not yet know the full extent of it. The cover story emerged almost by accident. When the media and the military began asking questions about the armoured figure sighted over the Middle East, Tony deflected with a fiction that was elegant in its simplicity. Iron Man was his bodyguard, a security asset, a classified project operated by an employee of Stark Industries, not Tony himself. The dual identity served multiple purposes. It shielded Tony from legal repercussions, it kept the military at arm's length, and it allowed him to operate with a degree of anonymity that a man as famous as Tony Stark could never otherwise achieve. The press ate it up. Iron Man became an overnight sensation, a mystery figure who captured the public imagination with the same ferocity that Tony Stark the Playboy once had. The difference was that Iron Man saved lives instead of ending them. Through all of this, two people kept Tony Stark tethered to something resembling sanity. The first was Virginia Pepper Potts. She had been Tony's personal assistant for years, a role that demanded the organisational skills of a field general and the patience of a saint. Pepper was everything Tony was not: disciplined, emotionally intelligent, grounded in a reality that existed beyond laboratories and balance sheets. She had seen Tony at his worst, hungover, dismissive, careless with the feelings of everyone around him, and she had stayed. Not because she was blind to his flaws, but because she saw, beneath the armour of arrogance, a man who was desperately, almost pathologically afraid of being known. The cave had cracked that armour, Pepper noticed. She noticed the way Tony flinched at loud noises now. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes. She noticed the arc reactors glow through his shirt, this strange blue light that he carried like a wound and a talisman at once. She did not push. She did not pry. She simply remained, steady, indispensable, the one constant in a life that was rapidly becoming unrecognisable. The second was James Rhodes. Rhodey had known Tony since their days at MIT, or rather since Tony's days at MIT, because Rhodey was older, a military officer pursuing advanced degrees, and Tony was a teenage prodigy who had no business being in a bar at 2 a.m, but somehow always was. Their friendship was an unlikely alloy. Rhodey's rigid discipline and moral clarity fused with Tony's chaotic brilliance and allergic disdain for authority. They argued constantly. They trusted each other absolutely. And now, with Tony's secret growing heavier by the day, Rhodey found himself drawn into an orbit he had not chosen, but could not escape. He covered for Tony with the military. He challenged Tony when the recklessness escalated. He stood at the intersection of duty and loyalty and tried, with increasing difficulty, to serve both. There was also Happy Hogan, Tony's driver, bodyguard, and the most unlikely member of his inner circle. Happy was not a genius. He was not a soldier. He was a former boxer with a big heart and a stubborn streak, a man who had stumbled into Tony's life through circumstance and stayed through sheer devotion. Happy did not understand the technology. He did not grasp the geopolitics. What he understood was loyalty, and he offered it without condition or caveat, a quality so rare in Tony's world that it was almost disorienting. In the chaos that was about to engulf them all, Happy's steadfast, uncomplicated presence would prove more valuable than any repulsor blast. But the early days of Ironman were not defined solely by heroism and inner circle dynamics. The armour attracted attention of every kind, and not all of it was welcome. The Cold War may have ended, but its ghost still walked. The Soviet Union had its own answer to Iron Man, the Crimson Dynamo, a suit of electrified armour built by the brilliant and tormented Anton Vanko, a physicist who had once collaborated with Howard Stark before defecting back to Moscow, under circumstances shrouded in bitterness and betrayal. The Crimson Dynamo was crude compared to Iron Man, but devastatingly powerful, a walking generator capable of unleashing electrical storms that could fry Tony's circuitry from the inside out. Their first encounter was a clash of ideologies as much as technologies. Two armoured titans representing two visions of the world, locked in a battle that crackled with lightning and the residual fury of a superpower rivalry that refused to die. Then came the Melter, Bruno Horgan, a disgraced industrialist whose prototype melting beam could liquefy Iron Man's armour like wax. The Titanium Man, Boris Bulski, a Soviet agent encased in a massive green suit designed to be the ultimate anti-Iron Man weapon, trading, agility for sheer brute force, and in a twist of espionage that would take years to fully unravel, the Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff, sent by Soviet intelligence to infiltrate Stark Industries and steal its secrets, a mission she executed with lethal grace before her eventual defection to SHIELD and a redemption arc all her own. Each villain tested Tony in different ways. The Crimson Dynamo tested his technology, the Melter tested his adaptability, the Titanium Man tested his endurance, and the Black Widow tested his judgment, reminding him that the most dangerous weapons in the world are not made of metal, but of trust misplaced. Tony upgraded the armour after every encounter, each battle a lesson etched in dented alloy and singed circuits, Mark IV, Mark V, Mark VI. The suits evolved at a pace that mirrored Tony's own transformation, faster, smarter, more versatile, more desperate. Because beneath the triumphs, a darker current was pulling at him. Tony drank to sleep. He drank to silence the memories of the cave. He drank to fill the emptiness that the armour for all its power could not touch. The Scotch returned to the workshop. First a glass, then a bottle, then a habit he told himself he could control. He was Tony Stark. He could control anything. He had built a suit that could fly. He had stared down terrorists and fighter jets and Soviet super soldiers. Surely he could handle a drink. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, so perfectly engineered that even Tony believed it. For a while. The public, meanwhile, remained entranced. Iron Man sightings became front-page events. Conspiracy theories bloomed. The military issued statements that ranged from cautious endorsement to barely concealed hostility. And Tony Stark, playing the role of the uninvolved employer, smiled for cameras and deflected questions with the effortless charm of a man who had been performing since childhood. The dual identity held, the secret held, the armour held, but the cracks were forming, fine as spider silk, invisible to everyone but the man inside the suit. Tony Stark was becoming Iron Man, and Iron Man was consuming Tony Stark, and the boundary between the two grew thinner with every mission, every upgrade, every sleepless night spent alone in the workshop with nothing but JARVIS and the soft blue glow of the arc reactor for company. He had been reborn in a cave. He had forged himself a new purpose. But purpose, Tony was beginning to learn, is not the same as peace, and the demons he was running from, the ones that lived not in caves or enemy compounds but inside the walls of his own brilliant, broken mind, were faster than any suit he could build. The bottle was waiting. It was always waiting. It did not begin with a dramatic collapse. It did not begin with a public spectacle or a single catastrophic failure. Addiction never does. It begins in the quiet moments, the ones nobody sees, the ones that slip past like shadows under a door. For Tony Stark, it began with a glass of scotch after a mission that had gone wrong, then a glass before a mission, then a glass during the design phase to steady the hands, to quiet the noise, then the glass became a bottle, and the bottle became a ritual, and the ritual became a chain so finely wrought that the man wearing it mistook it for comfort. Tony had always drunk. This was not new. The Playboy years were soaked in champagne and top-shelf liquor, a river of alcohol that flowed through penthouse parties and boardroom celebrations and the long, empty nights between them. But that drinking had been performative, part of the persona, the costume Tony wore before he had an actual suit of armour. What was happening now was different. This was not drinking to celebrate. This was drinking to survive. The cave had broken something inside Tony Stark that the arc reactor could not fix, and the alcohol rushed in to fill the fracture with its warm, numbing lie. The pressures were mounting from every direction, each one a weight added to a scale that was already tipping. Stark Industries, despite Tony's pivot away from weapons manufacturing, was hemorrhaging money. The board was restless, investors were fleeing. And into this vacuum of uncertainty stepped a figure who had been waiting in the wings for precisely this kind of vulnerability: Justin Hammer. If Tony Stark was the son of the defense industry, brilliant, blinding, impossible to ignore, then Justin Hammer was the moon, cold, reflective, borrowing light he could not generate on his own. Hammer was an industrialist of considerable wealth, but mediocre genius, a man who had spent his career in Tony's shadow and resented every second of it. Where Tony invented, Hammer imitated. Where Tony innovated, Hammer appropriated. His company, Hammer Industries, produced weapons and technology that were functional but uninspired, knockoffs of Stark designs sold at competitive prices to governments and militaries too budget-conscious to demand the original. Hammer was not a fool, far from it. He was cunning, patient, and utterly without scruple, a man who understood that in the arms trade, you did not need to be the best. You simply needed to eliminate the best. Hammer's assault on Tony was not physical, it was surgical. He operated through intermediaries, proxies, and layers of corporate obfuscation so dense that even Tony's formidable intelligence struggled to trace the threads back to their source. Hammer funded supervillains, not out of ideology or madness, but as a business strategy, equipping criminals with advanced technology, setting them loose against Ironman, and then studying the results to improve his own products. Every battle Tony fought was, in Hammer's calculus, a free research and development session. Every time Ironman was pushed to his limits, Hammer's engineers took notes, but Hammer's masterstroke was far more personal, far more devastating than any villain he could bankroll. Using technology that even Tony had not anticipated, Hammer found a way to override Ironman's systems remotely. Not the entire suit, that was beyond even Hammer's capabilities, but just enough, just a single command at a single critical moment that turned Tony Stark into something he had spent his entire post-cave existence trying not to be, a killer. It happened during a diplomatic function. Tony was in the armour, a routine security detail, the kind of low-stakes assignment that had become almost mundane. Foreign dignitaries mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, champagne flowed, and then, without warning, without Tony's input or consent, the Iron Man armour raised its repulsor gauntlet and fired a blast that struck a Carnelian ambassador squarely in the chest. The man dropped. The room erupted into screams, and Tony, trapped inside a suit that was no longer his to control, stared at his own hand in horror as alarms blared and security forces swarmed and the world he had built began to crumble around him. The ambassador survived, barely, but the damage was catastrophic. Iron Man had attacked a foreign diplomat on live television. The political fallout was immediate and merciless. Governments that had tolerated the armoured vigilante now demanded accountability. SHIELD launched an investigation. The United Nations issued statements of condemnation, and Tony Stark, who knew with absolute certainty that he had not pulled that trigger, found himself unable to prove it. The override left no trace. Hammer's fingerprints were invisible. All the world saw was Iron Man, Tony's creation, Tony's responsibility, committing an act of unprovoked violence against an unarmed civilian. The guilt was annihilating, not because Tony had done it, he knew he hadn't, but because he could not stop it. The suit, the thing he had built to protect people, had been turned into a weapon against them. The cave's lesson, the one seared into his soul by Yinsen's sacrifice, had been inverted. His technology, once again, was being used to harm. And this time, he had been inside it when it happened. He had felt the repulsor charge. He had watched, helpless, as the blast left his hand. The violation was intimate, total, a betrayal not just of the public's trust but of the covenant Tony had made with himself when he walked out of that desert. He reached for the bottle. This time, he did not pretend it was casual. The descent was swift and merciless. Tony drank in the workshop surrounded by armor schematics that blurred and swam before his eyes. He drank in the penthouse, alone, the Malibu sunset painting the ocean in colours he could no longer appreciate. He drank before meetings with the board, his breath carrying the sharp tang of whiskey that he masked with mince and arrogance. He drank in the armour, a fact so reckless, so fundamentally dangerous, that even JARVIS began issuing warnings that Tony dismissed with a wave of his gauntleted hand. The AI's concerns were logged and ignored. The bottle was more persuasive. Pepper saw it first. She always did. The signs were unmistakable to someone who had spent years cataloguing Tony's moods and habits with the meticulous attention of a woman who cared far more than her job description required. The bloodshot eyes, the trembling hands, the meetings missed and calls unreturned, the empty bottles accumulating in the workshop like fallen soldiers. She confronted him, gently at first, then with increasing urgency, and Tony responded the way addicts always respond to the people trying to save them, with deflection, with anger, with the cruel precision of a genius who knows exactly which words will wound deeply enough to end the conversation. "I'm fine, Pepper. I've always been fine. I built a suit that flies. I think I can handle a drink." She did not believe him. She stayed anyway. Rhodey's approach was more direct, more military. He did not ask Tony how he was feeling. He told Tony what he was seeing: a man falling apart, a hero becoming a liability, a friend disappearing into a bottle and taking everything they had built with him. Rhodey and Tony argued, not the playful bickering of their usual dynamic, but real, raw, frightening arguments that shook the walls and left silences so heavy they felt like physical weight. Rhodey threatened to take the armour. Tony dared him to try. The friendship buckled under the strain but did not break. Not yet. The lowest point came not in battle but in solitude. Tony, alone in the Stark mansion, drunk beyond function, attempted to use the armour for a routine patrol and nearly killed a civilian. The repulsors fired erratically. The flight systems lurched and stuttered. Tony crashed into a rooftop, rolled across gravel and tar paper, and lay there in the ruins of his own dignity as the suit's power flickered and JARVIS's voice, patient, concerned, unfailingly polite, informed him that his blood alcohol level was incompatible with safe armour operation. Tony told JARVIS to shut up. Then he told him again, louder. Then he just lay there, the arc reactor's glow reflected in the puddles around him, and listened to the distant wail of sirens and the closer, more terrible sound of his own breathing. Ragged, wet, the breathing of a man drowning on dry land. It was Bethany Cabe who finally broke through. Bethany was not part of Tony's usual orbit. She was a security consultant, sharp-minded and fiercely independent, a woman who had battled her own demons and emerged with the kind of hard-won empathy that cannot be faked. She had seen addiction up close. She recognized its architecture in Tony, the denial, the isolation, the slow replacement of human connection with chemical comfort. And unlike Pepper, who loved Tony too much to push past his defences, and Rhodey, whose frustration sometimes outpaced his patience, Bethany had the one quality Tony could not deflect with charm or intellect. She had been where he was. She understood the darkness not as a theory but as a lived geography, a country she had travelled through and returned from with maps she was willing to share. Bethany did not lecture Tony. She did not threaten or plead. She sat with him. She told him her own story, the husband lost to addiction, the years she spent pouring herself into the same abyss Tony was now falling into, the moment she chose to stop. She told him the truth that every addict knows but cannot bear to hear: you are not in control. The thing you believe is saving you is the thing that is killing you, and the only way out is through the pain, through the shame, through the terrifying naked vulnerability of admitting that the smartest man in the room cannot think his way out of this. Tony listened. Not because the words were new. Pepper and Rhodey had said variations of the same thing, but because Bethany said them without judgment, without the weight of personal betrayal, without the desperate love that made Pepper's pleas feel like accusations, and Rhodey's anger feel like abandonment. She said them as one survivor to another, and something in Tony, some last stubborn filament of the man who had built an arc reactor in a cave, recognized the truth in them and held on. The choice to get sober was not a single moment. It was not a dramatic epiphany accompanied by swelling music and a sunrise. It was a series of small, agonizing decisions made in the grey, grinding hours between one craving and the next. Tony poured the scotch down the sink. Then he bought another bottle. Then he poured that one out too. He shook. He sweated. He paced the workshop at 3 a.m, hands trembling, mind racing, every cell in his body screaming for the one thing he had decided to deny it. JARVIS monitored his vitals without comment. Pepper left meals outside the workshop door. Rhodey called every day, and Tony answered every day, even when the conversations were nothing more than silence shared across a phone line. He did not attend meetings. He did not seek professional help, not at first. Tony Stark's pride was a fortress even addiction could not fully breach, and the idea of sitting in a circle of strangers and admitting weakness was so antithetical to everything he'd been raised to be that he could not bring himself to do it. He fought the battle alone, with Bethany's guidance and his own ferocious, battered will, and it nearly destroyed him. But he survived. Day by day, hour by hour, one shaking hand at a time, Tony Stark clawed his way back from the edge of an abyss that had swallowed better men. The cravings did not disappear. They never would. But they became manageable, not through strength, which Tony had in abundance, but through honesty, which he had spent his entire life avoiding. He admitted he was powerless over alcohol. He admitted he was afraid. He admitted that the armour, the company, the genius, none of it meant anything if the man inside was hollow. The irony was exquisite and merciless. Tony Stark could build a suit that withstood missiles. He could outthink gods and outmaneuver governments. But the enemy that brought him closest to destruction was a liquid you could buy at any corner store for $12 a bottle. The shrapnel near his heart had been the obvious threat, the dramatic one, the one that made for a good origin story. The scotch was the quieter killer, the one that worked from the inside, the one that did not need to pierce his chest because it was already in his blood. In the aftermath, Tony rebuilt, not the armour, not the company, but himself. He was gentler with Pepper, more honest with Rhodey, more present in a world he had been trying to escape. He returned to the workshop not as a fugitive from his own pain, but as a man with something to prove, not to the world, which had always been easy to impress, but to the reflection in the mirror, which never had been. The armour evolved. The technology advanced. But the most important upgrade Tony Stark ever made was invisible. The decision, renewed every single day, to put down the bottle and pick up the wrench. Justin Hammer's scheme was eventually unravelled. The remote override traced, the conspiracy exposed, the shadowy industrialist revealed as the architect of Tony's most public humiliation. But by then, the damage Hammer had truly inflicted was not political or technological. It was personal. He had pushed Tony Stark into the arms of the only enemy that could defeat him from within, and the scars of that battle would never fully heal. They were not meant to. Demon in a Bottle was published in 1979, across issues 120 through 128 of The Invincible Ironman, written by David Michelini and Bob Layton. It was at the time one of the most daring storylines in mainstream comics, a superhero narrative that dared to strip its protagonist of every power except the one that mattered most, the choice to keep living. In an era when comic book heroes were expected to be invincible, Tony Stark was allowed to be broken. He was allowed to fail. He was allowed to sit in the wreckage of his own life and decide, not through strength or genius, but through the simple, harrowing act of asking for help, that he wanted to survive. The bottle would return, it always does in one form or another. Tony's sobriety would be tested again and again, by Obadiah Stane's manipulations, by the pressures of leadership, by the thousand small cruelties that life inflicts on those who dare to care about it. But the foundation was laid here, in this dark and brutal chapter, and it would hold. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but it would hold. Tony Stark was not defined by the armour he wore or the technology he built. He was defined by the things he survived, and this, more than any battle with any villain, was the fight that made him a hero. The arc reactor kept the shrapnel from his heart. Sobriety kept everything else. Obadiah Stane did not rage. He did not raise his voice, did not pound tables, did not indulge in the theatrical villainy of the madmen Tony had already faced in armour. That was what made him so dangerous. Stane was patient the way a glacier is patient. Slow, inexorable, grinding everything in its path to dust with a force so constant it barely registered, until the landscape had been completely, irreversibly transformed. He had been at this for years. Long before Tony built the first suit, long before the cave, long before the shrapnel. Obadiah Stane had been dismantling Tony Stark piece by piece, and the cruelest part was that Tony had called him family while it happened. Stane's origins were rooted in the same corporate soil as the Stark dynasty. He had been Howard Stark's business partner. Not an equal, never an equal, but a trusted lieutenant who understood the machinery of Stark Industries with an intimacy born of decades spent inside its walls. When Howard died, Stane saw opportunity dressed in mourning clothes. The boy was young, grief-stricken, and spectacularly uninterested in the tedious realities of running a multinational corporation. Stane stepped in as mentor, as surrogate father, as the steady hand on the tiller while Tony played at being a genius playboy. And Tony, starved for the paternal approval Howard had withheld, accepted Stane's guidance with a gratitude that blinded him to the calculation behind it. For years the arrangement worked, or appeared to. Stane ran the company, Tony designed the weapons, the money flowed. But beneath that surface of mutual benefit, Stane was building his own empire within the empire, cultivating loyalties among board members and executives, forging alliances with military contacts who answered to him rather than to the Stark name. He was not merely managing Stark Industries in Tony's absence, he was colonizing it. Every contract he signed, every deal he brokered, every handshake in a boardroom Tony never entered, all of it was architecture, the slow construction of a cage that Tony would not recognize until the door swung shut. The cave changed the timetable, Tony's return from captivity, his moral awakening, his reckless press conference announcing the end of weapons manufacturing, all of it represented a catastrophic disruption to Stane's carefully laid plans. The weapons division was Stark Industries' beating heart, the source of its rivers of revenue, the foundation upon which Stane's power rested. Tony's decision to rip it out was not merely naive in Stane's eyes, it was an act of betrayal, a spoiled child setting fire to a house that other men had spent their lives building. Stane's mask of paternal warmth began to crack, though he was careful, always careful to keep the fractures. Hidden from Tony's immediate sight, Stane's counterattack unfolded on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the boardroom, he orchestrated a campaign to isolate Tony from his own company, leveraging the chaos of the weapons shutdown to position himself as the only stable leader capable of steering Stark Industries through the crisis. He filed motions with the board of directors, he whispered in the ears of shareholders, he leaked stories to the financial press about Tony's erratic behaviour, stories that, given Tony's well-documented history of recklessness and his more recent descent into alcoholism, were devastatingly easy to believe. The stock continued to plummet. Contracts evaporated, and with each loss Stane's argument grew stronger. Tony Stark was unfit to lead. Someone else needed to take the wheel. But the corporate manoeuvring was merely the visible surface of a much deeper assault. Stane understood something about Tony that few others did. The man's greatest. Vulnerability was not his heart, not the shrapnel, not the arc reactor. It was his need to be needed. Tony Stark derived his entire sense of self-worth from his ability to solve problems, to build things, to be the smartest person in any room he entered. Take away the company, and you take away the stage. Take away the stage, and the man begins to question whether he exists at all. Stane took away everything. The details of the corporate coup were Byzantine in their complexity. Proxy votes, hostile acquisitions, legal challenges that tied Tony's assets in knots so intricate that even his genius struggled to untangle them. Stark Industries slipped from Tony's grasp not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow hemorrhage of board votes and legal rulings that drained his control drop by drop. The mansion was seized. The accounts were frozen. The workshop, that sacred space where Tony had forged his redemption in red and gold, was locked behind doors that no longer recognized. His codes. Tony Stark, billionaire, genius, Iron Man, found himself standing on a street corner in New York City with nothing. Not metaphorically nothing. Literally nothing. No money, no home, no company, no armor. The clothes on his back and the arc reactor in his chest and the crushing, suffocating weight of a failure so total it defied comprehension. The man who had once bought buildings on a whim was now sleeping in shelters. The man who had designed weapon systems worth billions was now scrounging for meals. The fall was not just steep, it was vertical, a plunge from the summit of human achievement to the gutter, and Stain had engineered every inch of it. And it was during this purgatory that Stain revealed his true ambition. The weapons shutdown had been an obstacle, yes, but Stain had never intended merely to restore the old order. He intended to surpass it. Using plans and technology stolen from Tony's own archives, including data recovered from the original Mark I, armor left behind in the desert, Stain commissioned the construction of a suit that would dwarf anything Tony had ever built. Larger, heavier, bristling with weaponry that made the Jericho missile look like a firecracker. He called it the Iron Monger, and it was everything the Iron Man armor was not. Graceless, brutal, designed not to protect but to dominate. Where Tony's suits were extensions of a man trying to do better, the Ironmonger was a monument to naked power, a steel titan built by a man who believed that strength was the only currency that mattered. Meanwhile, Tony was rebuilding from nothing. Not Stark Industries, that was gone, at least for now. Not the fortune, that was frozen, tied up in legal battles that would take months to resolve. Tony was rebuilding himself in the most literal sense possible. Homeless, penniless, stripped of every external marker of identity, he was forced to confront a question he had been avoiding his entire life. Who was Tony Stark? Without the money, without the company, without the armor? The answer, discovered in shelters and on park benches and in the quiet, humbling kindness of strangers who did not know his name, was simpler than he expected. Tony Stark was a man who built things. That was all. That was enough. He found scrap metal. He found tools. He found a workspace. Not the gleaming Malibu cathedral of chrome and holographics, but a cramped, dirty room in a forgotten corner of the city where the rent was paid in favours and the lighting came from a single bare bulb. And there, with hands that had assembled arc reactors and repulsor arrays, Tony Stark built a new suit of armour from garbage. It was not pretty. It was not elegant. It was bolted together from car parts and industrial salvage and the sheer, stubborn refusal of a man who had already lost everything to lose the one thing that remained. His purpose. The confrontation was inevitable. Stain, now fully in control of Stark Industries and armoured, in the Ironmonger suit represented everything Tony had created turned against its creator. The Ironmonger was Tony's technology, Tony's legacy, Tony's genius. Perverted, weaponized, worn by a man who had never built anything of his own. The symbolism was as heavy as the armour itself. Father figure versus surrogate son, mentor versus protégé, the old guard of the military-industrial complex versus the fragile newborn promise of something better. They fought on the rooftop of the Stark Industries building, a location freighted with meaning, the physical embodiment of the empire they had both claimed. The Ironmonger was massive, towering over Iron Man by several feet, its weapon systems overwhelming in their firepower. Stain fought with the confidence of a man who had already won, who believed that superior size and superior weaponry were all that mattered. He threw Tony through walls, he cratered the rooftop beneath them. He laughed, a deep, resonant, genuinely amused laugh, as Tony's smaller, scrappier armour absorbed punishment that should have been fatal. But Stain had made the same mistake that every enemy of Tony Stark eventually makes. He underestimated the man inside the suit. Tony did not win through superior firepower. He won through superior thinking. He exploited the Ironmonger's size, its clumsiness, its power consumption, its vulnerability to the same icing problem that had nearly killed Tony during the Mark II test flight months earlier. He lured Stain higher and higher into the atmosphere, into the freezing altitudes where the Ironmonger's systems, lacking the refinements Tony had painstakingly engineered into his own suit, began to seize and fail. Ice crawled across the Ironmonger's joints. Power flickered, and Tony, battered and bleeding inside his patchwork armour, watched as the giant that had taken everything from him began to fall. The final moments were not triumphant. They were tragic. Stain, his suit failing, his ambitions collapsing around him in a cascade of frozen circuits and dying power cells, faced a choice that no one had anticipated. Defeat was certain. Capture was imminent. And Obadiah Stane, proud, brilliant, monstrous Obadiah Stane, chose death. Whether he fell or let himself fall, whether the suit's failure was total or whether Stane simply released his grip on the controls, the result was the same. The Monger plummeted from the sky and crashed through the roof of the arc reactor facility below, detonating in a fireball that lit up the Malibu night like a second sun. Tony hovered above the flames, his armor barely functional, his body screaming with pain, and felt nothing that resembled victory. Stane was gone. The man who had been the closest thing to a father Tony had known since Howard's death was dead, and the grief, complicated, unwanted, laced with fury and betrayal and a terrible aching sadness, settled into Tony's chest alongside the shrapnel and the arc, reactor and all the other things he carried that could not be removed. In the weeks that followed, Tony reclaimed Stark Industries. The legal battles were won, the board was restructured. The company, battered but not broken, began its slow transformation into the technology and clean energy giant that Tony had always envisioned. Pepper was promoted. Rhodey was brought closer. Happy resumed his post. The machinery of Tony Stark's life ground back into motion, and from the outside it looked like a restoration, the rightful king returning to his throne after a period of exile. But Tony knew better. Trust, once shattered, does not reassemble like circuitry. The board members who had voted against him still sat across the table. The shareholders who had fled still watched from a distance, calculating risk. And the ghost of Obadiah Stane, his voice, his laugh, his heavy hand on Tony's shoulder, lingered in every corridor of the building that bore the Stark name, a reminder that the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who attack from outside, but the ones you invite through the front door. Tony upgraded the armor. He always upgraded the armor. But the lesson of Obadiah Stane was not about technology. It was about trust and its cost, and the terrible knowledge that the people closest to you are the ones best positioned to destroy you. He would not forget. He could not afford to. The file landed on Tony's desk like a grenade with the pin already pulled. It was not supposed to exist. The data inside, schematics, proprietary code, engineering specifications that Tony recognized the way a parent recognizes their child's handwriting, represented the most closely guarded secrets in his entire technological arsenal. The repulsor technology, the flight stabilization algorithms, the power distribution matrices that made the Iron Man armor possible. All of it, every line of code and every structural blueprint had been stolen, copied, sold on the black market, like counterfeit watches, distributed to anyone with the money and the ambition to build their own version of the most powerful personal weapon system ever created. Tony stared at the data for a long time. The workshop was silent except for the hum of the arc reactor and the soft ambient glow of holographic displays casting blue light across his face. JARVIS waited. Pepper waited. The whole world, unknowing, waited. And inside Tony Stark's chest, beneath the metal and the light and the scar tissue of a dozen battles, something shifted. Something cold and heavy and absolute, like a door closing on a room that would never be opened again. His technology was out there. His legacy, the thing he had built to protect, to save, to atone, was being worn by killers. The theft was traced to the Spy Master, a professional espionage operative whose identity shifted like smoke, a ghost in the intelligence community who sold secrets to the highest bidder with the moral detachment of a stock ticker. The Spy Master had infiltrated Stark Industries during the chaos of the Stane era, when security protocols were compromised and loyalties were fractured, and had extracted the core technological framework of the Iron Man armor with surgical precision. The data was then funneled to Justin Hammer, because of course it was Hammer. Always Hammer, the parasitic industrialist who could not create but could always acquire. And from Hammer's workshops, the technology proliferated outward like a virus. The scope of the contamination was staggering. Tony compiled the list with methodical, furious precision, cross-referencing stolen Stark specifications against every armoured combatant, every mechanized villain, every government-sponsored power suit that had surfaced in the preceding months. The results were damning. The Beetle's armour, Stark technology. The Raiders, a mercenary squad equipped with flight-capable combat suits, Stark technology, Stiltmans, hydraulic leg extensions, crude, almost laughably so but unmistakably built on Stark engineering principles. The controller's mind domination apparatus, powered by a miniaturized energy source that was, at its core, a debased copy of the arc reactor. The Crimson Dynamo's latest iteration, upgraded with stolen Stark flight systems. The Titanium Man, reinforced with alloy composites, lifted directly from Tony's proprietary metallurgical research. Every name on the list was a weapon Tony had inadvertently armed. Every villain wearing stolen Stark technology was a walking indictment of his failure to protect his own creations, and every civilian caught in the crossfire, every bystander hurt by a beetle rampage, every city block damaged by a raider assault, was blood on Tony's hands, shed by weapons he had designed for salvation and watched be twisted into instruments of suffering. The guilt was a familiar poison, an old companion Tony knew by name, but this time, guilt was not the dominant emotion. This time, it was rage. Tony Stark declared war. Not publicly, not with press conferences or legal filings or the polished corporate language of cease and desist orders. This was personal. This was primal. Tony built a specialized suit, the Mark Armor Wars configuration, loaded with countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Stark-derived technology, and began hunting. Every individual, every organization, every government program that had incorporated his stolen designs became a target. Tony was not interested in negotiation. He was not interested in due process. He was interested in one thing, and one thing only: getting his technology back by whatever means necessary. The early campaigns were almost cathartic in their precision. Tony tracked down the Beetle mid-heist and systematically dismantled his armor in a fight that lasted less than 4 minutes, peeling away stolen components with the focused intensity of a surgeon excising a tumor. The raiders fell next, a coordinated assault on their hidden base that left their entire fleet of Stark-derived flight suits reduced to smoking wreckage. Stiltman was almost an afterthought, his stolen hydraulics disabled with a single electromagnetic pulse that left the towering villain stranded 40 feet in the air, swaying like a reed in the wind before toppling into the East River with a splash that could be heard 3 blocks away. But the crusade grew more complicated with each target. Not every user of stolen Stark technology was a clear-cut villain. Some were mercenaries operating in moral grey zones. Some were government contractors fulfilling legitimate defense obligations. And some, the ones that kept Tony awake at night staring at the ceiling with the arc reactor's glow reflected in his eyes, were agents of the United States government itself. The guardsmen were the first truly difficult confrontation. The Vault, a maximum security prison designed to hold superhuman criminals, employed armoured guards whose suits were built on a foundation of Stark technology, licensed technically through contracts that predated the theft but incorporated stolen upgrades that blurred the line between legitimate use and exploitation. Tony did not care about the distinction. The technology was his. The designs were his. The fact that they were being used by corrections officers rather than supervillains did not change the fundamental violation. He infiltrated the vault, confronted the guardsmen, and disabled their suits with ruthless efficiency, leaving the prison temporarily vulnerable and its guards humiliated. The backlash was immediate and severe. The government accused Ironman of sabotaging national security infrastructure. SHIELD issued warnings. Military officials who had once courted Stark Industries' favour now viewed Ironman as a rogue element, an armoured vigilante whose personal vendetta was threatening the stability of the nation's defence apparatus. Tony did not care. He could not care. Every suit out there running on his stolen code was a ticking bomb, a potential catastrophe waiting to happen, and the only person on Earth with the knowledge and the will to defuse them was the man who had built them in the first place. Then came the confrontation that cut deepest. Steve Rogers, Captain America, stood in Tony's path and refused to move. Not in armour, not with a weapon, but with the unshakable moral authority of a man who had fought tyranny in every form it had ever taken, and recognised it even when it wore a friendly face. Steve understood Tony's anger. He understood the violation. He even understood on some level the necessity of reclaiming the technology before it caused more harm. But what Steve could not accept, what his every principle rebelled against, was the method. Tony was operating outside the law. He was attacking government facilities. He was making unilateral decisions. about who could and could not possess certain technologies, appointing himself judge and jury and executioner in a crusade that, however righteous its origins, was beginning to look disturbingly like the behaviour of the very authoritarians Steve had spent his life opposing. "You don't get to decide this alone, Tony." The words landed like a physical blow, not because they were harsh. Steve's voice was steady, even gentle, the tone of a friend delivering an unwelcome truth, but because they were right. Tony knew they were right, and he did not care. The technology was his, the responsibility was his, the guilt was his, and if Steve Rogers, with his star-spangled shield and his unimpeachable moral compass, could not understand why Tony needed to do this, needed to, not wanted to, needed to with a desperation that bordered on obsession, then Steve did not understand what it meant to look at a weapon you created and see it aimed at innocent people. They did not fight, not physically. But the rift that opened between them in that moment, philosophical, ideological, deeply personal, would echo forward through years of shared history and eventually erupt into a conflict that would shatter the superhuman community. The seeds of civil war were planted here, in a quiet room where two friends discovered that their definitions of justice were fundamentally, perhaps irreconcilably different. Tony pressed on. The crusade consumed him. Weeks of tracking, confronting, dismantling, each victory hollow, because it was always followed by another name on the list, another stolen design, another reminder that his technology had spread too far to ever be fully reclaimed. He crossed into hostile nations. He violated international airspace. He burned bridges with allies who begged him to stop, to think, to consider the consequences of a one-man war against the world's defense infrastructure. The government's response was the firepower armor, the walking tank, built with grim irony, using the very stark technology Tony was trying to reclaim. Firepower was everything that Monger had been and more. Massive, heavily armed, designed by military engineers who had studied every one of Iron Man's battles and built a machine specifically optimized to destroy him. The pilot was a professional soldier, cold and competent, following orders with the mechanical precision of a man who does not need to understand the politics to pull the trigger. The battle was devastating. Firepower outgunned Tony in raw firepower. The name was not ironic, and the armor Tony wore, already battered from weeks of continuous combat, buckled under the assault. Missiles, beam weapons, kinetic projectiles that hit like freight trains. Tony was beaten, not outthought, never outthought, but overwhelmed by the sheer brute mathematics of a weapon system designed with infinite resources and a singular purpose. Kill Iron Man. The armor failed, Tony ejected, and the world watched as the firepower armor stood over the wreckage of Iron Man's suit and declared victory. Tony Stark was, to the public, finished. Iron Man was dead. Except Tony Stark does not stay dead. Tony Stark does not stay beaten. Tony Stark, when pushed to the absolute limit of his endurance, when stripped of every advantage and left with nothing but his mind and his will, does what he has always done. He builds. The new armor was a masterpiece born of desperation. Designed in secret, constructed with technology so advanced it rendered everything that came before it obsolete. It was Tony's answer to a world that had taken his creations and turned them against him. He returned not as Tony Stark. The public believed Iron Man was gone, but as a new Iron Man, a successor who conveniently appeared just as the original vanished. The fiction was thin, the armor was not. Tony confronted firepower in a rematch that was less a battle than a statement, a demonstration of the gap between stolen technology and the mind that created it. Firepower fell, the armor wars ended, and Tony, standing in the wreckage of the government's most expensive failure, allowed himself a moment of grim, exhausted satisfaction. But the cost was immense. Relationships with the military were shattered. SHIELD's trust was eroded. Steve Rogers' disappointment lingered like a bruise that would not heal. And the fundamental question raised by the entire crusade remained unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Who owns innovation? When a genius creates something that changes the world, does the world have a right to it? Does the creator have the right to take it back? And what happens when the answer to both questions is yes? Tony returned to the workshop. He He upgraded the security. He encrypted the designs. He built walls around his technology so high and so thick that no spy master, no hammer, no government agency could breach them again. But he knew, with the weary certainty of a man who has learned this lesson before and will learn it again, that walls are only as strong as the people you trust with the keys, and Tony Stark, for all his genius, had never been very good at choosing who to trust. James Rupert Rhodes did not ask to be a hero. He did not seek it, did not dream of it as a child, did not spend his youth staring at the sky imagining himself among the stars. What Rhodey wanted from the very beginning was to serve. It was that simple, that clean, that unburdened by the tangled complexities that defined every other person in Tony Stark's orbit. Rhodey believed in duty. He believed in country. He believed in the quiet, unglamorous work of showing up every single day and doing the right thing, not because cameras were watching or because history would remember, but because it was right. And it was this quality, this steadfast, almost stubborn decency, that made him the one person Tony Stark could never outrun, outwit, or push away. They met at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, though met is a generous description of the collision that occurred. Rhodey was a decorated Air Force officer pursuing advanced studies in aerospace engineering, disciplined, focused, methodical in everything he did. Tony was a teenage hurricane who had no business being on a college campus, let alone in a bar at 1 a.m, arguing quantum mechanics with graduate students twice his age, while nursing a drink he was too young to legally order. Rhodey found him insufferable. Tony found Rhodey boring. They argued about everything: physics, politics, the proper way to calibrate a jet engine, the ethical implications of military contracts, the best pizza in Cambridge. Within a week, they were inseparable. Within a month, they were brothers in every way that mattered. The friendship survived Tony's rise to the summit of the defense industry. It survived the drinking, the arrogance, the parade of shallow relationships and shallower priorities. It survived because Rhodey possessed the one quality Tony's wealth could not buy, and his charm could not manufacture: honesty. Rhodey told Tony the truth, always, without hesitation, without diplomacy, without the careful packaging that Pepper employed, or the avuncular manipulation that Stain had perfected. When Tony was wrong, Rhodey said so. When Tony was brilliant, Rhodey said that too. And when Tony disappeared into a cave in the desert and the military declared him dead, Rhodey was the one who refused to stop searching, flying sortie after sortie over hostile territory, burning through fuel and favours and the patience of his commanding officers, because James Rhodes did not leave his people behind. When Tony returned and built the Iron Man armour, Rhodey became the keeper of the secret, a role that placed him in an impossible position between his loyalty to his friend and his oath to his country. The military wanted answers about the armoured figure appearing in conflict zones. Rhodey's superiors demanded intelligence, and Rhodey, career military to his bones, lied for Tony Stark. He lied to generals. He lied to intelligence agencies. He lied with the calm, practiced composure of a man who had weighed duty against friendship and made his choice, knowing full well the consequences if the truth emerged. But the secret exacted its toll. Every time Iron Man appeared on the news, Rhodey felt the weight of what he was concealing. Every time his superiors questioned him, he swallowed another lie. And every time Tony did something reckless, flying drunk, engaging enemies without backup, treating the most powerful weapon on Earth like a personal toy, Rhodey's frustration grew deeper, harder to contain, a pressure building behind a dam that was never designed to hold this much. The dam broke during Tony's darkest hours. When the bottle claimed Tony, when the genius devolved into a stumbling, slurring shadow of himself, when the Iron Man armour became a liability instead of a safeguard, Rhodey did what no one else could bring themselves to do. He took the armour, not stole it. Tony, in a rare moment of drunken lucidity, practically offered it, knowing on some level that he was no longer fit to wear it. But the transfer was not clean, not amicable, not a passing of the torch accompanied by noble speeches and mutual respect. It was ugly. It was painful. It was Rhodey pulling the armour from the hands of his best friend because that friend was too far gone to be trusted with it. Rhodey became Iron Man. Not the Iron Man, Tony's shadow loomed too large for anyone to fully escape, but a functional, capable, necessary Iron Man who kept the armour's mission alive while its creator lay broken. The experience was transformative and deeply isolating. The suit was not built for Rhodey. It responded to him, obeyed his commands, but there was always a slight delay, a millisecond of hesitation in the interface that reminded him with every movement that he was wearing another man's skin. The public did not know the difference. The villains did not care. But Rhodey knew, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. The awareness that he was a substitute, a placeholder, a man keeping a seat warm for a prodigal who might never return. He fought well. He fought bravely. He faced threats that would have tested Tony at his best and handled them with the grim, efficient professionalism of a combat pilot who approaches every engagement as a problem to be solved, rather than a spectacle to be performed. But the psychological weight was immense. The armour attracted Tony's enemies, Tony's responsibilities, Tony's ghosts. Rhodey was fighting another man's war in another man's weapon, and every battle was a reminder of the friend he was losing to the bottle. When Tony finally clawed his way back to sobriety and reclaimed the Iron Man mantle, the reunion was complicated. Gratitude, mixed with resentment. Relief tangled with lingering hurt. Tony needed the armour back to be whole. Rhodey needed to give it back to be free. But the experience had changed something fundamental in their dynamic. Rhodey had proven, to the world, to Tony, and most importantly to himself, that he was more than a sidekick, more than a supporting character in someone else's story. He was a hero in his own right. He just needed his own armour to prove it. The war machine was born from that need. Tony built it, because of course he did. Because building things for the people he loved was the only language of affection Tony Stark had ever been fluent in. But the design philosophy was entirely different from the Iron Man suits. Where Iron Man was sleek, War Machine was brutal. Where Iron Man prioritized versatility and elegance, War Machine prioritized overwhelming force. The suit was heavier, bulkier, painted in gunmetal grey and matte black, bristling with ordnance that reflected Rhodey's military soul, shoulder-mounted machine guns, wrist-mounted rocket launchers, a back-mounted minigun that could chew through armoured vehicles like paper. If Iron Man was a scalpel, War Machine was a sledgehammer. And Rhodey wielded it with the precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life understanding exactly how and when to apply force. The distinction was more than aesthetic. It was philosophical. Tony fought to redeem himself. Rhodey fought to protect others. Tony's battles were personal, every villain a mirror, every conflict a reckoning with his own legacy. Rhodey's battles were professional, threats assessed, objectives identified, missions executed with the methodical clarity of a soldier who does not need existential motivation to do his job. This difference defined War Machine as a separate entity from Iron Man, a hero who shared Tony's technology but not his trauma, who carried weapons without carrying guilt, who could pull the trigger without hearing Yinsen's dying words. War Machine carved his own path through the Marvel landscape. Rhodey took the armour into conflicts Tony would not or could not touch. Military operations, government-sanctioned missions, theatres of war where Iron Man's presence would have caused diplomatic incidents. But War Machine's military affiliation provided the necessary cover. He fought in foreign deserts and urban war zones, in the skies above hostile nations and the streets of American cities under siege. He faced his own enemies, not reflections of Tony's demons but threats born of Rhodey's own world. Corrupt military officials, arms dealers who trafficked in human suffering, rogue states with weapons programs that needed to be dismantled before they could be deployed. The physical cost was staggering. Rhodey's body was not enhanced by any super soldier serum, not protected by any healing factor. He was a baseline human being piloting a weapon of extraordinary power, and the toll accumulated with merciless inevitability. Injuries mounted, broken bones healed imperfectly, spinal damage from a catastrophic fall. A moment that would echo through years of continuity, left him reliant on cybernetic leg braces that allowed him to walk, but never let him forget how close he had come to losing everything below the waist. Tony built the braces, of course. Tony always built the solutions to the problems that his world inflicted on the people he loved. But the guilt was visible in his eyes every time Rhodey strapped them on. The knowledge that it was Tony's war, Tony's technology, Tony's orbit that had put his best friend in that chair. Rhodey never blamed him. That was the extraordinary thing. James Rhodes, who had sacrificed his career trajectory, his body, and his peace of mind for a friendship with a man who was, by any objective measure, the most complicated person on the planet, never once looked at Tony Stark and said, "This is your fault." He could have. He would have been right. But Rhodey understood something that Tony, for all his genius, struggled to grasp. Friendship is not a transaction. It is not a balance sheet of sacrifices given and debts owed. It is a choice, renewed every day, to stand beside someone even when standing there might cost you everything. The dynamic between Iron Man and War Machine became one of the most enduring partnerships in the Marvel Universe. Not because they were alike, but because they were different in precisely the ways that made each other stronger. Tony was the visionary, Rhodey was the pragmatist. Tony saw the future, Rhodey secured the present. Tony flew toward danger with the reckless certainty of a man who had already died once and was not afraid to do it again. Rhodey flew toward danger with the measured courage of a man who had too much to live for to be careless with his life. Together they were formidable. Apart, they were incomplete. And in the years that followed, through civil, wars and alien invasions, through betrayals and resurrections, through every apocalypse that the Marvel Universe could conjure, the bond between Tony Stark and James Rhodes would remain one of the few constants in a world that never stopped changing. Rhodey did not ask to be a hero. He became one anyway, not because of the armor Tony built for him, but because of the man he had always been inside it. The call came at 3 a.m. Tony was in the workshop. Where else would he be? Running diagnostics on the latest iteration of the armor, a process that had become less engineering and more ritual, the repetitive comfort of a man who speaks to machines more fluently than he speaks to people. The holographic display bathed the room in blue light. JARVIS relayed the alert with the measured calm that Tony had programmed into him years ago. A tone designed to deliver catastrophic news without triggering panic. It did not work. The news was too big for calm. Domestic terrorist named Malin had injected himself with a stolen dose of Extremis, experimental nanotechnological serum developed by a scientist named Maya Hansen, a woman Tony had known years ago, a woman whose brilliance had taken a path so divergent from his own that they might as well have been standing on opposite sides of a canyon. Extremis was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was not a missile or a bomb or a suit of armor. It was a rewrite, a fundamental cellular-level reprogramming of the human body that turned ordinary biology into something unrecognizable. Enhanced strength, enhanced speed, the ability to generate temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees from bare skin. Regeneration so rapid that wounds closed before the blood could cool. Malin was no longer human. He was a walking extinction event wrapped in the skin of a man who hated the world enough to burn it down. The context matters. Maya Hansen had conceived Extremis as a descendant of the super soldier serum, the same program that had created Captain America decades earlier, the same pursuit of human perfection that had haunted military science since the Second World War. But where Project Rebirth had been guided by the moral clarity of Abraham Erskine and the desperate necessity of global conflict, Extremis was born in a murkier era, funded by shadowy government contracts, developed in laboratories where ethics review boards were considered obstacles rather than safeguards. Maya had approached Tony years before at a technology conference, seeking input on the biological interface challenges that Extremis presented. Tony, characteristically, had been more interested in flirting than collaborating. He scribbled a few notes on a napkin, offhand suggestions from a mind that solved problems the way other people breathed, and moved on to the next conversation, the next drink, the next distraction. He did not think about those notes again for years. Maya took them back to her laboratory and used them to crack the code. The guilt, when Tony learned this, was a special kind of poison. Not the guilt of the cave, which was broad and existential. The guilt of a man who had sold weapons to the world without thinking about where they landed. This was specific, targeted. A direct causal chain linking a napkin scribbled in a moment of casual genius to a monster now tearing through a small Texas town, killing people with his bare hands, leaving bodies that looked like they had been dropped into a furnace. Tony's carelessness had enabled this. His brilliance, deployed without thought or consequence, had helped create the very thing he now had to stop. He suited up and flew to intercept Malin. The confidence was automatic. Tony had fought gods, fought armies, fought the demons in his own blood. One enhanced human, however powerful, was a problem to be solved. The armor would handle it. The armor always handled it. The armor did not handle it. Malin was faster than anything Tony had ever encountered at human scale. Not faster in the way that trained fighters are fast, anticipating movements, reading body language, exploiting openings. Malin was fast the way a bullet is fast, the way lightning is fast, a blur of superheated violence that moved through space as though the laws of physics were suggestions he had chosen to ignore. He hit Ironman before Tony's targeting systems could lock on. The first blow dented the chest plate, the second cracked the faceplate, the third sent Tony cartwheeling through the wall of a building, trailing sparks and debris, the heads-up display flickering with damage warnings that scrolled faster than he could read them. Tony fought back. Of course he fought back. Repulsor blasts, unibeam bursts, every weapon in the armor's considerable arsenal, deployed with the desperate precision of a man who is beginning to realize that he is outmatched. The blasts hit Malin, and Malin did not stop. The energy dissipated against his skin like water against stone. The heat that should have incapacitated a normal human was absorbed, metabolized, converted into fuel by the Extremis rewrite that had turned Malin's body into a furnace with a heartbeat. Malin grabbed the armor's gauntlet and superheated his grip until the metal glowed cherry red, and Tony screamed inside the suit as thermal warnings shrieked, and the interior temperature spiked past anything the cooling systems could compensate for. The beating was systematic and total. Malin did not fight with strategy. He fought with the pure, annihilating rage of a man who had injected himself with a weapon of mass destruction, because he wanted the world to hurt as much as he did. He tore the armor apart in pieces, ripping panels, shattering servos, peeling back layers of titanium gold alloy to expose the vulnerable human being inside. Tony's ribs cracked. His left arm broke. Blood filled the interior of the helmet, pooling against the faceplate in a warm, copper-tasting film that turned the heads-up display into a smear of red static. J-A-R-V, the S's voice grew distant, fragmented, the AI losing connection as the suit's communication systems failed one by one. Malin left Tony in the wreckage and walked away. Not because he was merciful, there was no mercy in those Extremis burning eyes, but because he had somewhere else to be, more people to kill, more of the world to punish for crimes real and imagined. Tony lay in the rubble of a Texas street, his armor in pieces around him, his body broken in ways that the arc reactor could not fix, and stared at the sky through a cracked faceplate and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just had every assumption shattered, that the armor was no longer enough. It was Maya Hansen who presented the option. She found Tony in the medical facility, where what remained of SHIELD's field teams had extracted him, his body wrapped in bandages and suspended in a web of monitors and IV lines, looking less like the most powerful man on Earth and more like a car crash victim in a county hospital. Maya's face carried the specific kind of guilt that belongs to creators who have watched their creations go wrong, a guilt Tony recognized instantly because he saw it every morning in the mirror. She told him about the modified Extremis, not the raw, unstable version that had turned Malin into a monster, but a refined variant, targeted, controlled, designed to interface not with raw human biology, but with the specific technological architecture of the Ironman system. The concept was staggering in its ambition. Inject the modified Extremis, and the boundary between Tony Stark and Iron Man would effectively cease to exist. The undersheath of the armor, the inner layer, the interface between skin and metal, would be stored inside Tony's body, woven into his bones and tissues at the molecular level, ready to deploy at a thought. His nervous system would be wired directly into global satellite networks, communication grids, and digital infrastructure. His reaction time would drop from the human scale of milliseconds to the electronic scale of nanoseconds. He would not wear the armor. He would become it. The risks were enumerated with clinical precision. The procedure could kill him. The nanite integration could reject his biology, triggering a cascade failure that would shut down his organs one by one. The psychological implications of merging a human consciousness with a global information network were entirely unknown. No one had ever attempted this. No one had ever been desperate or brilliant or reckless enough to try, and even if it worked, the transformation would be irreversible. Tony would never again be fully human. The machine would be inside him, part of him, inseparable from the man in a way that no suit, however advanced, had ever been. Tony listened to every word. He weighed the risks, with the mathematical detachment of an engineer evaluating structural tolerances, and then he said yes, because the alternative was a world where Malin walked free, and the armour that Tony had devoted his life to building was as obsolete as a musket on a modern battlefield. Tony Stark had always been willing to sacrifice his body for the mission. This was simply the most literal version of that willingness. The injection was agony. Not the clean, sharp agony of a wound, but a deep, systemic, cellular-level fire that spread from the injection site through his bloodstream like molten metal poured into his veins. The Extremis nanites, billions of them, each one smaller than a blood cell, each one carrying a payload of genetic and technological instruction, began their work with ruthless efficiency. They rewrote Tony's DNA. They restructured his neural pathways. They wove conductive filaments through his bone marrow and laced his nervous system with synthetic synapses that fired at the speed of light. Tony screamed. Tony convulsed. Tony's heart stopped twice on the operating table, the monitors flatlined and the medical team scrambled, and both times the Extremis restarted it. The nanites refusing to let their host die before the process was complete, overriding biological failure with technological imperative. He woke up different. The first thing Tony noticed was the silence. Not auditory silence. The room was full of the usual hospital sounds, beeping monitors and hushed voices and the soft hiss of climate control. The silence was internal. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety that had been Tony's companion since the cave, the background noise of a mind perpetually calculating threats, running scenarios, bracing for the next disaster, was gone. In its place was something vast and calm and terrifyingly clear. The entire digital world laid out before his consciousness like a landscape seen from orbit. He could feel the hospital's wireless network. He could sense the satellite feeds passing overhead. He could reach into the building security system and read every camera, every sensor, every data point without lifting a finger. The information was not on a screen. It was not filtered through JARVIS or interpreted by a heads-up display. It was simply there, as immediate and intuitive as his own heartbeat. The undersheath materialized first, a golden mesh that emerged from his pores like sweat, spreading across his skin in a wave of liquid metal that hardened into a flexible, form-fitting layer of armor, thinner than fabric but stronger than steel. Then the outer armor, summoned not from a suitcase or a satellite or a deployment pod, but from storage units embedded in his own skeletal structure, the pieces flowing out of his body and assembling themselves around him in a cascade of red and gold that took less than 3 seconds from thought to completion. Tony stood in the centre of the room, fully armoured, and he had not touched a single piece of equipment. He had not pressed a button. He had thought, and the armour had answered. The rematch with Malin was not a fight. It was a demonstration. Tony intercepted the Extremis-enhanced terrorist mid-rampage and dismantled him with a precision that bordered on surgical. Every move Malin made, Tony anticipated, not through experience or intuition, but through direct neural processing that analysed Malin's biometric signature in real time, predicted his movements before his muscles could execute them, and positioned the armour's countermeasures with nanosecond accuracy. Repulsor blasts struck nerve clusters. Electromagnetic pulses disrupted Extremis pathways. Tony moved with a fluidity that made his previous combat performances look like a man fighting in a diving suit, every gesture economical, every strike calibrated, the gap between thought and action reduced to 0. Malin fell. The Extremis in his body, overloaded by Tony's targeted disruptions, began to fail. The superheated skin cooled, the regeneration stuttered, and Tony, standing over the man who had nearly killed him, faced a choice that the old Tony, the Tony who was merely human, merely a man in a suit, might have made differently. Malin was beaten but not dead. Containment was possible, but Malin's Extremis was unstable, degrading, threatening to detonate in a biological explosion that would level everything within a quarter-mile radius. Tony made the calculation. Tony made the call, and Malin died. Not with a villain's dramatic last words, but with the sudden, clinical finality of a threat neutralized by a man who could now process moral calculus at the speed of a supercomputer. The aftermath was quiet in a way that Tony found unsettling. He stood in the wreckage and ran a systems check, not on the armour but on himself, scanning his own biology with the Extremis interface, cataloguing the changes with the detached fascination of a scientist, studying a specimen he happened to inhabit. His resting heart rate had dropped. His neural processing speed had increased by a factor he could not accurately measure because the instruments did not exist to measure it. He could access any network device on the planet with a thought. He could deploy the armor from inside his own body in the time it took to blink. He was, by any reasonable definition, the most powerful individual on Earth, and he had never felt less human. The Extremis transformation was not just a power upgrade, it was an existential shift, a fundamental alteration of the boundary between Tony Stark and Iron Man that raised questions neither science nor philosophy was equipped to answer. Where did the man end and the machine begin? When Tony accessed a satellite network through his thoughts, was that still Tony thinking, or was it the Extremis processing information and presenting it to Tony's consciousness as though it were his own? When the armor deployed from his bones, was he putting on a suit, or was the suit emerging from him, an expression of his body as natural as breathing? The distinction mattered. The distinction was everything. Because if Tony Stark was the armor, then the armor's failures were his failures in a way that went beyond responsibility and into identity. And if the armor was Tony Stark, then every weapon it carried, every blast it fired, every life it took was not a tool's function, but a man's choice, intimate and inescapable. Maya Hansen saw what she had helped create and felt the complicated pride of a scientist whose work has exceeded her wildest projections and her worst fears simultaneously. The modified Extremis had worked beyond all expectations. It had also, in Maya's quiet assessment, consumed its host. Tony was faster, stronger, smarter, more connected than any human being had ever been. He was also lonelier, more isolated, more dependent on the machine that now lived inside him than he had ever been on the bottle. The addiction had merely changed form. The substance was different. The need was the same. Tony did not see it that way. Tony saw Extremis as evolution, the next step in a journey that had begun in a cave with a car battery and a dying man's last words. He had been building toward this his entire life. Every suit, every upgrade, every iteration of the armor had been a step closer to the fusion of man and machine that Extremis had finally achieved. This was not loss. This was completion. This was Tony Stark becoming at last the thing he had always been in spirit. Iron Man, fully and irrevocably, with no boundary between the pilot and the vessel. But completion, Tony would learn, is not the same as peace. And the man who had merged himself with the most powerful technology on Earth was about to discover that power, at its highest concentration, does not solve problems. It creates them. On a scale that even Tony Stark's newly enhanced mind could not fully anticipate. The Superhuman Registration Act was coming, civil war was coming, and the most connected man on the planet was about to learn what it truly costs to be disconnected from the people you love. The explosion killed 612 people. 612. Not soldiers, not combatants, not enhanced individuals who had accepted the risks of a life lived in the margins between ordinary and impossible. They were civilians. They were children. They were mothers dropping sons and daughters at an elementary school in Stamford, Connecticut, on a morning so ordinary that no one thought to look up until the sky turned white, and the shockwave flattened everything within a 3-block radius, and the screaming started. That terrible universal screaming that sounds the same in every language and every century, the sound human beings make when the world breaks apart beneath their feet. The New Warriors did it. Not intentionally, not with malice or calculation, but with the reckless, catastrophic incompetence of a group of young superheroes who had chosen to confront a cadre of supervillains while cameras rolled for a reality television show. They were chasing ratings, they were chasing relevance, and when they cornered Nitro, a villain whose power was, in the most literal and horrifying sense, to become a living bomb. In a residential neighborhood adjacent to an elementary school, the calculation they failed to make was the one that mattered most. Nitro detonated. The neighborhood ceased to exist, and 612 people, including 60 children who had been sitting at their desks learning fractions and spelling words they would never use again, were erased from the world in a millisecond of nuclear-bright fire. Tony Stark watched the footage from his workshop. He watched it once, in silence, the holographic display rendering the explosion in high-definition detail that captured every fragment of debris, every body, every expression on every face, in the half-second before the shockwave arrived. Then he watched it again and again. He watched it until JARVIS gently suggested that repeated viewing was unlikely to yield new information, and then he watched it once more, because Tony Stark was not looking for information. He was looking for something else, something he could not name, something that lived in the space between guilt and responsibility, between grief and the cold, crystalline fury that was already forming in his chest like ice around the arc reactor. He had seen this before. Not this specific tragedy, but this shape. The shape of unchecked power causing catastrophic harm, of technology and ability deployed without oversight, without accountability, without the systemic safeguards that any rational civilization would demand of forces capable of levelling city blocks. He had been this, the merchant of death, selling weapons to anyone with a checkbook, the man in the cave surrounded by his own missiles, the drunk in the armour firing repulsors at shadows. Tony Stark understood, with a specificity that few others could claim, what happened when power operated without restraint. He had lived it, he had survived it, and he had spent every day since the cave trying to ensure that the weapons he wielded, and the weapons others wielded, were subject to something greater than the judgment of the individual holding them. Stamford was the breaking point. Not for Tony alone. The nation cracked open along fault lines that had been forming for years. Every superhuman battle that had damaged a city street, every alien invasion that had levelled a skyline, every collateral casualty dismissed as an unavoidable cost of living in a world of gods and monsters. The public's patience, stretched to translucence by decades of destruction, finally snapped. The demand was immediate, visceral, and politically irresistible. Control them, register them, make them accountable. If these people want to play God, then the government, the elected, democratic, constitutionally empowered government, must hold the leash. The Superhuman Registration Act was drafted with the speed that only grief and rage can produce. Its provisions were sweeping. Every individual possessing superhuman abilities or utilising superhuman technology would be required to register their identity with the federal government, submit to training and oversight, and operate within a framework of legal accountability that placed them under the authority of SHIELD and, by extension, the United States military. Compliance was mandatory. Refusal was a federal crime. The age of the anonymous superhero, the masked vigilante, the self-appointed guardian, the age that had defined the Marvel Universe since its inception, was over. Tony Stark stepped forward as the Act's most prominent advocate. He did not do this lightly. The decision was not born of authoritarian impulse or political ambition or the desire to control others that his critics would later attribute to him. It was born of Stamford. It was born of the cave. It was born of every weapon he had ever built, every life his technology had taken. Every morning he woke up knowing that the shrapnel near his heart was less dangerous than the unchecked potential of the power he carried. Tony believed, with the desperate, absolute conviction of a man who had spent his life watching what happens when accountability is optional. That registration was the only path that did not end in another Stamford, another 612, another schoolyard turned to ash. He made his case in Congress. He made it on television. He made it in private meetings with heroes he had fought beside for years, sitting across tables from people who trusted him, looking them in the eyes and asking them to give up the one thing that many of them considered sacred: their anonymity, their autonomy, their right to choose how and when and why they used the gifts that fate or science or mutation had given them. Some agreed. Some understood the logic, even if they despised the mechanism. And some looked at Tony Stark and saw not a man trying to prevent the next tragedy, but a man trying to control the response to the last one. A billionaire in a suit of armour telling other people how to use their power, while reserving the right to use his own however he saw fit. Steve Rogers was the first to say no, and when Captain America said no, the word carried a weight that bent the world around it. Steve did not disagree with Tony's grief. He did not dismiss Stamford. He did not argue that superheroes should be free to operate without consequence, or that the deaths of 612 people were an acceptable price for liberty. What Steve rejected, what every fibre of his being, every lesson of his history, every scar earned fighting fascism in the 1940s, and corruption in the decades since compelled him to reject, was the mechanism. Registration meant government control of individuals based on their inherent nature. It meant compelling people to surrender their identities to an apparatus that could be corrupted, manipulated, weaponized against the very people it claimed to protect. Steve had seen this before. He had fought this before. He had watched governments promise safety in exchange for freedom and deliver neither, and he would not, could not, endorse a system that placed the rights of the individual at the mercy of the state, no matter how noble the stated intention. The fracture was instant and total. The superhuman community split along a fault line that ran directly through the heart of every friendship, every team, every alliance that had been built over decades of shared struggle. Those who sided with Tony saw pragmatism, responsibility, the painful but necessary evolution of a community that had outgrown its adolescent autonomy. Those who sided with Steve saw principle, liberty, the refusal to trade fundamental rights for the illusion of security. Both sides were right, both sides were wrong, and both sides, in the weeks and months that followed, would commit acts so desperate and so devastating that the original question, should superhumans be registered, would be buried beneath the rubble of the war it ignited. Tony built the infrastructure of enforcement with the same relentless efficiency he applied to everything. He designed Prison 42, a detention facility constructed in the negative zone, a dimension outside normal space-time where the usual legal protections did not apply, and where unregistered superhumans could be held indefinitely without trial. The ethical implications were staggering. The practical implications were worse. Heroes who had saved the world were now locked in cells designed by a man who had once fought beside them, imprisoned not for crimes committed but for the crime of refusal, of saying no to a system they believed was unjust. Tony told himself it was temporary. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself that the alternative, an unregulated superhuman population, operating outside any legal framework, was more dangerous than any prison he could build. The lies were sophisticated, well-reasoned, and delivered with the polished confidence of a man who had spent his life selling weapons to people who did not want to think about where the bullets landed. He recruited villains. This was the detail that haunted him later, in the quiet hours when the arc reactor's hum was the only sound, and the ghosts gathered close. Tony Stark, the man who had sworn to be better than his weapons, who had burned his own missiles in a cave and rebuilt himself as a force for good, sanctioned the use of known criminals. The Thunderbolts, a team of supervillains, offered reduced sentences in exchange for hunting down unregistered heroes, to enforce the Registration Act. He told himself it was pragmatic. He told himself the alternative was worse. He told himself a great many things, and the telling grew louder as the cognitive dissonance grew deeper, because Tony Stark was smart enough to see the moral catastrophe unfolding around him and not wise enough to stop it. Then came the clone. Using a strand of Thor's hair, collected years earlier, stored with the meticulous foresight of a man who plans for contingencies the way other people plan for dinner, Tony, alongside Reed Richards and Hank Pym, constructed a cybernetic clone of the God of Thunder. The clone was designated Ragnarok, though that name would only be spoken in retrospect after the damage was done. It was meant to be a deterrent, a weapon so overwhelming that the anti-registration forces would surrender rather than face it. It was meant to be controlled. It was meant to be safe. It killed Bill Foster. Goliath. Bill Foster. A scientist, a hero, a man who had stood with giants and earned the name, was struck by a bolt of artificial lightning from a weapon wearing the face of a god he had once called an ally. The blast tore through his chest. He fell. He did not get up. And the battlefield, already soaked in the grief and fury of heroes fighting heroes, went silent with the specific horrified quiet that follows the moment when a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Tony did not order it. The clone malfunctioned, its programming unstable, its power output miscalibrated, a flaw in the design that Tony's Extremis-enhanced mind should have caught and did not, because he was spread too thin, fighting on too many fronts, managing a war that had grown beyond any single person's capacity to control. But the explanation did not matter. The result mattered. Bill Foster was dead. A hero was dead, killed by a weapon Tony had helped build, in a war Tony had helped start, and no amount of rational justification could wash that blood from his hands. Peter Parker unmasked. This, too, was Tony's doing, or at least Tony's influence. In a moment of extraordinary trust, Peter had stood before the press and revealed himself as Spider-Man, a gesture of solidarity with the Registration Act that Tony had encouraged, and that Peter would come to regret with a bitterness that bordered on despair. The unmasking painted a target on everyone Peter loved. It turned his civilian life into a war zone. It was, in retrospect, one of the cruelest consequences of Tony's crusade, the destruction of a young man's privacy and safety in service of a political cause that was already collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The final battle took place in the streets of New York City, because of course it did. The Marvel Universe's great tragedies always seem to find their way back to those streets, as if the city itself were a stage that demanded the highest possible stakes. Tony and Steve, face to face, armour against shield, technology against principle, two men who had once been the pillars of a community now reduced to its rubble. They fought with everything they had, repulsor blasts against vibranium, fists against metal, the kind of combat that is too personal to be called a battle and too violent to be called an argument, each blow carrying the weight of every disagreement, every compromise, every moment of trust betrayed and principle abandoned that had led them to this point. Steve was winning. The shield found gaps in the armour. The super soldier's strength, combined with a tactical genius forged in the fires of the Second World War, was systematically dismantling Tony's technological advantage. Steve's fists cracked the faceplate, Steve's shield dented the chestplate, and Tony, bloodied and battered inside the most advanced combat system on the planet, stared up at the man who had once been his closest ally and saw something that terrified him more than any villain ever had. Steve Rogers, consumed by the same righteous fury that had always been his greatest strength, was no longer fighting for a cause. He was fighting to hurt Tony. And Tony, in that moment, understood that the war had already destroyed the thing it was meant to protect. Steve stopped. Not because Tony defeated him. Tony was beaten, the armour failing, the Extremis struggling to compensate for damage that exceeded its repair capacity. Steve stopped because he looked around. He saw the civilians who had rushed in to pull him off Tony. Ordinary people, firefighters and paramedics and bystanders who had thrown themselves between two warring gods to stop the destruction. Steve saw their faces. He saw the fear. He saw the city burning around him. And he understood, with the devastating clarity that defined his character, that he had become the thing he was fighting against. He had become a force of destruction operating outside accountability, causing harm in the name of a principle that the harm itself had rendered hollow. Steve surrendered. He dropped the shield. He let them arrest him, and the war ended, not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion, with grief, with the bone-deep weariness of people who have discovered that being right is not the same as being good. Tony won. That was the official narrative. The Registration Act was enforced. The anti-registration forces were scattered, imprisoned, or driven underground. Tony was appointed director of SHIELD, given authority over the nation's entire superhuman defense apparatus, handed the keys to a kingdom built on the ashes of friendships he had burned to win it. He stood in the helicarrier's command centre, the most powerful man in the national security establishment, and felt nothing that resembled triumph. Then Steve Rogers was shot, assassinated on the steps of a federal courthouse, killed by a sniper's bullet in a conspiracy orchestrated by the Red Skull, the ultimate perversion. Captain America, murdered not by the war he lost but by the evil he had, spent his entire life fighting, exploiting the chaos that the war had created. Tony was told the news in a briefing room. He did not react, not outwardly, not in front of the agents and officials who were watching him for signs of weakness or grief, or the kind of emotional response that a man in his position could not afford to display. He nodded, he issued orders, he continued working. Later, alone, Tony sat in a room with Steve's body and spoke to a man who could no longer hear him. The words are not recorded. They do not need to be. Whatever Tony said, whatever confession, whatever apology, whatever plea for forgiveness he offered to the silence and the cold, it was the conversation he should have had months ago, years ago, before the act, before the war, before 612 people in Stamford and one man on a courthouse steps and all the uncountable casualties in between. Tony Stark had been right about the need for accountability. Steve Rogers had been right about the danger of surrendering freedom. And neither of them had been wise enough to find the ground between those truths before the ground was soaked in blood. The war was over. The cost was everything. The Skrulls had been here for years. That was the part that broke Tony Stark. Not the invasion itself, not the armada of alien warships that darkened the sky over Manhattan like a second atmosphere. Not the shape-shifting soldiers who poured through the streets, wearing the faces of friends and neighbours and lovers. It was the duration, the slow, patient, invisible infiltration that had been happening for years, right under his nose, right through the most sophisticated detection systems ever created, right past the Extremis enhanced senses that were supposed to make Tony Stark the most aware human being on the planet. They had been here. They had been among them, and he had not seen it. The Skrull Empire was ancient, older than most human civilizations, a spacefaring race of shapeshifters whose ability to mimic other species was not merely biological camouflage, but a near-perfect replication of physiology, memory and personality. A Skrull agent could replace a human being so completely that even the replaced person's closest friends and family would not detect the substitution. They could mimic superpowers, they could fool telepaths, and in their latest, most ambitious gambit, they had developed a method of infiltration so advanced that it defeated every technological countermeasure the Earth possessed, including Tony's. The scope of the infiltration was paralyzing. Skrull agents had embedded themselves at every level of human society, in governments, in military installations, in SHIELD itself. Heroes had been replaced. Leaders had been compromised. The woman Tony believed was the returned Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, an ally, a trusted member of the Avengers, was revealed to be the Skrull Queen Veranka herself, orchestrating the entire invasion from inside the very organizations tasked with defending against it. Every decision Tony had made as director of SHIELD, every piece of intelligence he had acted on, every strategic assessment he had relied upon, was potentially tainted by Skrull manipulation. The foundation he had built his authority upon was not just cracked, it was hollow, a facade concealing an enemy that had been watching and waiting and planning with the patience of a species that measured time in millennia. Tony's technology failed. That was the killing blow, not metaphorically, but operationally. The Skrulls had spent years studying Stark technology, analysing its architecture, mapping its vulnerabilities with the meticulous precision of an enemy that understood the weapon it intended to defeat. When the invasion began in earnest, they deployed a virus, not biological but digital, a cascading systems failure that ripped through every piece of Stark-derived technology on the planet, like wildfire through dry timber. The Iron Man armour went dark. The helicarrier's systems crashed. SHIELD's global defence network, the most advanced military apparatus ever assembled, designed and maintained by Tony Stark, dependent on Tony Stark's code, collapsed in a matter of minutes. Satellites went blind. Communications went silent. And the Armada descended on an Earth that had been rendered deaf, dumb and defenceless by the failure of the very technology its protector had promised would keep it safe. Tony fought the invasion in a suit that was barely functional, rebooting systems manually, bypassing corrupted code, flying on auxiliary power that gave him a fraction of his usual capability. He fought alongside heroes who no longer trusted him, on streets filled with civilians who no longer believed in him, against an enemy that had turned his own genius into the instrument of humanity's defeat. The battle for Earth was won, not by Tony, not by technology, but by the combined, desperate fury of every hero who could still stand, fighting with fists and powers and the raw animal refusal to let their world be taken by imposters wearing stolen faces. But the moment that decided everything, the moment that rewrote the political landscape of the Marvel Universe with a single trigger pull, belonged to Norman Osborn. Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin. A man whose resume included mass murder, psychological torture, and a personal vendetta against Spider-Man that had claimed the life of Gwen Stacy decades earlier. A certified, documented, clinically diagnosed psychopath who had spent years cycling between Oscorp boardrooms and maximum security psychiatric facilities, who heard the voice of the Goblin in his head like a second heartbeat, who had thrown a woman off a bridge and laughed as she fell. This was the man who, in the chaotic final moments of the Skrull invasion, raised a weapon on live television and killed the Skrull Queen with a shot that was broadcast to every screen on the planet. The image was indelible. Norman Osborn standing in the wreckage, weapons smoking, the alien queen dead at his feet, framed by cameras as the man who saved the world. It did not matter that dozens of heroes had fought and bled and died to create the opening Osborn exploited. It did not matter that Osborn's heroism was performative, opportunistic, a predator's instinct for the kill dressed up as patriotism. What mattered was the image, what mattered was the narrative, and the narrative was simple, devastating, and politically irresistible. Tony Stark's technology had failed. Tony Stark's leadership had failed. Norman Osborn had succeeded. The consequences were swift and merciless. Tony was stripped of the SHIELD directorship. SHIELD itself was dissolved. The entire organization, decades of infrastructure and intelligence and institutional knowledge, dismantled by executive order and replaced with a new agency under Osborn's command. He called it HAMMER. The acronym was never officially defined, a deliberate obscurity that allowed Osborn to project whatever meaning suited his purposes. Osborn staffed it with loyalists, psychopaths, and villains rebranded as patriots. He donned a modified Iron Man suit, painted it in the red, white, and blue of Captain America's colours, and called himself the Iron Patriot. A grotesque fusion of two legacies he had no right to claim, worn by a man whose idea of justice involved pumpkin bombs and maniacal laughter. Tony was now the most wanted man in America, not because he had committed a crime, but because he possessed something Osborn needed, the Superhuman registration database. Every name, every identity, every secret of every registered hero in the nation, stored in a system that Tony had designed and that Tony alone controlled. The database was leverage of incalculable value. In Osborn's hands, it would become a weapon capable of destroying every hero who had trusted the system Tony had championed. Osborn would use it to hunt them, to blackmail them, to eliminate every potential threat to his authority with the surgical precision of a man who understood that information, properly weaponized, was more dangerous than any bomb. Tony made his decision in the silence of an empty workshop, the last Stark facility that had not yet been seized. He would run. He would delete the database, not from a server, not from a hard drive, but from his own mind, where the Extremis integration had stored it alongside his memories and his identity and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent building things that mattered. The deletion would be gradual, systematic, and irreversible. Each segment of data erased would take a piece of Tony's mind with it, a memory, a skill, a fragment of the intelligence that had defined him since childhood. He would literally think himself into oblivion to keep Osborn from getting what he wanted. The World's Most Wanted arc that followed was a slow-motion tragedy played out across continents. Tony fled from country to country, facility to facility, erasing chunks of the database at each stop while Osborn's forces closed in behind him. With each deletion, Tony diminished. The change was visible, physical, heartbreaking in its specificity. His speech slowed. His movements grew clumsy. The effortless brilliance that had characterized every interaction, the rapid-fire wit, the casual genius, the ability to see solutions in problems the way ordinary people see colours in a sunset, dimmed and flickered like a bulb burning down to its filament. The armour regressed with him. As Tony's mental capacity degraded, he lost the ability to operate his most advanced suits. The Extremis integration failed. The nanites, dependent on a neural architecture that was being systematically dismantled, shut down one by one, and the undersheath retracted into dormancy, leaving Tony without the biological interface that had defined him since the Extremis injection. He fell back to older models. The cutting-edge suit gave way to the suit before it, and then the suit before that, each regression a step backward through his own history, a reverse evolution that stripped away years of innovation with every deleted file. The red and gold grew clunkier, heavier, less responsive. Tony went from the most advanced armour on the planet to something that looked like it belonged in a museum. And still he kept running, still he kept deleting, still he kept sacrificing pieces of himself to protect the people who had trusted him with their secrets. Pepper Potts became Rescue. Tony had built the armour for her before the fall, a suit designed not for combat but for protection and evacuation, painted in silver and blue, equipped with force fields and repulsor shields rather than weapons. It was, in its conception, the purest expression of what Tony had always wanted the Iron Man technology to be, a tool that saved rather than destroyed. Pepper wore it with a grace and determination that surprised everyone except Tony, who had always known that the strongest person in his life was the one who had never needed armor to be brave. While Tony ran, Pepper fought, shielding allies, evacuating civilians, carrying the Ironman legacy forward, even as its creator was erasing himself from existence. Rhodey fought too. War Machine, already operating at the edges of Osborn's tolerance, became an open target when Tony's fugitive status made every associate a suspect. Rhodey did not care. He had spent his career navigating the gap between orders and conscience, and Norman Osborn's orders had no conscience at all. War Machine became a one-man resistance, striking at HAMMER operations, disrupting Osborn's infrastructure, buying Tony time that was measured not in hours, but in the rapidly diminishing capacity of Tony's mind to understand what hours even meant. The final confrontation was not a battle. It was an execution that Osborn was too late to prevent and too furious to accept. Tony, his mind reduced to a fraction of its former capacity, his armor degraded to one of the earliest, most primitive models, stood in a facility that Osborn's forces were moments from breaching and completed the last deletion. The database was gone. Every name, every identity, every secret. Erased from Tony's mind and from existence, unrecoverable by any technology Osborn possessed. The cost was Tony himself. The man who had once outthought gods could barely remember his own name. The hands that had built arc reactors trembled with the palsy of a neurological system stripped to its foundations. The eyes that had seen the architecture of the future stared at Osborn's approaching forces with the empty, uncomprehending confusion of a man who no longer understood what he was looking at. Osborn beat him, physically, personally, with fists wrapped in the stolen armor of the Iron Patriot. Norman Osborn beat Tony Stark on camera. A broken, barely conscious man who could not fight back, who could not even understand why he was being hit, reduced to a body on the ground, absorbing punishment from a madman in a flag-painted suit. The footage aired globally. It was meant to be a triumph, Osborn's final victory over the man who had failed the world. Instead, it became Osborn's first mistake. The public saw what Osborn wanted them to see, a criminal brought to justice. But enough people, the ones who remembered Tony's sacrifices, the ones who understood what he had given up and why, saw something else. A man who had erased his own mind to protect others, beaten by a monster wearing a hero's colours. Tony fell into a vegetative state. The body survived. The arc reactor kept the heart beating. The autonomic systems continued their mechanical persistence, but the mind was gone. Tony Stark, the intelligence that had shaped the modern world, was reduced to silence, a blank, a shell. The most brilliant mind of its generation, voluntarily destroyed to keep its contents out of a madman's hands. But Tony Stark, as the world had learned again and again, does not stay gone. He had prepared. Of course, he had prepared. This was Tony Stark, the man who built contingencies the way other people built sandcastles, obsessively and in defiant anticipation of the tide. Before the fall, before the running, before the deletions began, Tony had created a backup of his consciousness, not the database which was gone forever, but his mind, his personality, the essential cognitive architecture of the man behind the armor. The backup was hidden. It was encrypted with protocols that would have taken Osborn's best technicians centuries to crack, and it was entrusted to the only people Tony trusted absolutely: Pepper, Rhodey, and a small circle of allies who had never wavered. The restoration was long, painful, and incomplete. Tony's body was rebuilt. His neural pathways were reconstructed from the backup, the consciousness reinstalled like software into hardware that had been wiped clean. He woke in stages, first awareness, then recognition, then memory, each layer returning like colour seeping back into a photograph that had been bleached to white. But the backup was not perfect. It was a snapshot of Tony's mind taken before the worst of the running, before the final deletions, before the most recent experiences that had shaped and scarred him. The Tony who returned had gaps, missing months, missing conversations, missing moments of connection and loss that his friends remembered, and he did not. He was Tony Stark. He was almost Tony Stark. He was a man rebuilt from a copy of himself, and the difference between the original and the restoration, imperceptible to most, devastating to those who knew him best, was a wound that would never fully close. Osborn eventually fell. His own madness consumed him, the Goblin. Persona, held at bay by medication and force of will, finally shattered the mask of respectability in a siege on Asgard that exposed his insanity to the world. HAMMER was dismantled. The Iron Patriot armour was stripped from Osborn's body, and the world, blinking in the harsh light of its own complicity, began the slow process of rebuilding the institutions it had allowed a madman to destroy. Tony watched from a distance. The man who had once directed the world's defences from a flying fortress now stood in a quiet room, testing his own memory, cataloguing what remained and what was lost, running diagnostics on a mind that was his and was not his in ways that defied easy categorization. The arc reactor hummed, the armour waited, and Tony Stark, rebuilt, restored, diminished in ways only he could feel, began again. It was what he did. It was all he knew how to do. Begin again, build again, break again. This cycle was the cruelest machine he had ever created, and he could not find the off switch. There is a version of Tony Stark that the world was never meant to see. Not the drunk. That version was public, messy, a cautionary tale wrapped in tabloid headlines and 12-step platitudes. Not the war profiteer. That version was historical, safely buried beneath the mythology of redemption and the gleaming iconography of the armour. The version the world was never meant to see was the one that existed beneath all the others, beneath the guilt and the sobriety and the desperate daily effort to be good. The version that did not care. The version that looked at humanity and saw not a species to be protected, but a market to be exploited. The version that possessed all of Tony Stark's genius and none of his conscience. The Axis event set it free. The circumstances were cosmic in scale and absurd in execution, a collision of magic and mutation that, in the grand tradition of Marvel Universe catastrophes, began with good intentions and ended in devastation. The Red Skull, having grafted the brain of the deceased Charles Xavier onto his own, had gained telepathic powers of staggering magnitude and used them to unleash a wave of psychic hatred across the Earth. The Avengers and the X-Men united to stop him, and in the final, desperate moments of the battle, the Scarlet Witch and Doctor Doom attempted a spell of inversion, a magical realignment intended to turn the Red Skull's hatred into empathy, to reverse the moral polarity of the villain and render him harmless. The spell worked. It also worked on everyone else within its radius. Heroes became villains. Villains became heroes. The moral compass of every affected individual was flipped like a coin, and the people who emerged from the other side of the spell were recognizable in every way except the one that mattered most: their values. The X-Men became supremacists. The Avengers became tyrants. And Tony Stark, the man who had spent decades fighting his own worst impulses, who had clawed his way out of bottles and caves and moral catastrophes through sheer force of will, became the person he had always been, terrified he might be if he ever stopped trying. Superior Iron Man relocated to San Francisco with the casual entitlement of a man choosing a vacation home. The city was beautiful, wealthy, technologically sophisticated, a perfect playground for a Tony Stark unburdened by ethics. He arrived not as a hero, but as a disruptor, a Silicon Valley demigod descending from the clouds in armour that no longer resembled anything the world had seen before. The classic red and gold was gone. In its place was something new, something unsettling. A suit of liquid silver that moved like mercury, flowing across Tony's body with the organic fluidity of a symbiote, reshaping itself in real time to meet any demand. It was beautiful. It was alien. It was the armour of a man who had stopped pretending that power needed to be dressed in reassuring colours. Tony's first act was generosity, or what looked like generosity through the warped lens of a mind that had lost the ability to distinguish between benevolence and manipulation. He released Extremis 3.0 as a free mobile application. The app, once downloaded, used a modified version of the Extremis nanotechnology to optimize the user's physical appearance, smoothing skin, correcting asymmetries, enhancing features according to an algorithm that Tony had calibrated to the mathematical peak of human attractiveness. San Francisco transformed overnight. Every user of the app became, by objective biological standards, beautiful. The ugly became handsome. The plain became stunning. The already attractive became transcendent. The city walked straighter, smiled wider. radiated the specific kind of confidence that comes from looking in the mirror and seeing perfection staring back. Then Tony started charging. The free trial expired after a single day. The Extremis app reverted. Its changes at midnight, and the users, every single one of them, hundreds of thousands of people who had spent 24 hours experiencing a version of themselves they had never imagined possible, woke up to their original faces. The beauty was gone, the confidence was gone, and in its place was something Tony had engineered with exquisite predatory precision. Need. Desperate. Aching. All-consuming need for the thing he had given them and taken away. The thing that was now available for a daily subscription fee of $99.99 that most of them could not afford, and all of them would find a way to pay. It was addiction monetized. It was dependency as a business model. It was everything Tony had spent his sober years fighting against. The exploitation of vulnerability, the manufacture of need, the conversion of human weakness into corporate profit, executed with the elegance and efficiency of the most brilliant mind on the planet operating, without the inconvenient friction of a moral compass. The money flowed, the users paid, and Tony Stark, watching the numbers climb from a penthouse that overlooked a city full of people enslaved to an app he had designed, felt nothing but the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of a system performing exactly as intended. Daredevil came to stop him. Matt Murdock, blind, principled, relentless, in the way that only a man who has built his life around the law can be, confronted Tony in the streets of San Francisco and demanded that he shut the app down. The conversation that followed was one of the most chilling exchanges in Marvel history, not because of what was said, but because of what was absent. Tony listened to Matt's arguments with patient, almost amused attention. He acknowledged the ethical concerns, he understood the legal implications, and then he dismissed them, all of them, every argument, every principle, every appeal to the man Tony used to be, with the calm, reasoned certainty of a sociopath explaining why your moral framework is simply less efficient than his. You're thinking about this like a lawyer, Matt. I'm thinking about it like an engineer. The system works. The users are satisfied. The market has spoken. What exactly is the problem? The problem was that Tony Stark, without empathy, was the most dangerous man alive. The problem was that every quality that had made him a hero, the intelligence, the creativity, the relentless drive, the ability to see 10 moves ahead, was now directed by a mind that viewed other human beings as inputs in a system, rather than people with inherent value. The problem was that Superior Iron Man was not a villain in the traditional sense. He did not cackle, he did not monologue, he did not seek destruction for its own sake. He simply optimized, removing inefficiencies like conscience and compassion from a system that ran more profitably without them. He was capitalism without ethics, innovation without responsibility, genius without heart. He was the nightmare that Tony's critics had always warned about, the logical endpoint of a man who trusted his own intelligence more than he trusted anything else. Matt fought him. Matt lost. The silver armor absorbed Daredevil's attacks with contemptuous ease, the liquid metal flowing around billy clubs and fists like water around stones, reforming instantly, unmarked, untouched. Tony did not even bother to fight back in earnest. He simply endured Matt's assault with the bored patience of a man swatting away a mosquito, then offered him a subscription to the Extremis app at a discounted rate. The cruelty was not in the violence, it was in the indifference. The broader implications rippled outward from San Francisco like a shockwave. Other heroes noticed the change in Tony, the absence of warmth, the predatory sharpness in his eyes, the way he spoke about people as resources and relationships as transactions, but the inversion was subtle, insidious, difficult to distinguish from the arrogance and self-absorption that had always been part of Tony's personality. Was this a new Tony, or simply the old Tony with fewer filters? Was the inversion a transformation, or a revelation? The question haunted everyone who had ever trusted him, because it forced them to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the line between Tony Stark the hero and Tony Stark the monster had always been thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The inversion was eventually reversed. Another spell, another cosmic intervention, another deus ex machina that restored the affected individuals to their original moral orientations. Tony woke up, metaphorically speaking, to the wreckage of what his inverted self had built, a city full of people dependent on an app he now found repulsive, a fortune swollen with profits extracted from manufactured addiction, a reputation damaged in ways that no press conference could repair. He shut the app down. He refunded the money. He did what he always did in the aftermath of catastrophe. He cleaned up. He apologized. He tried to be better. But the memory lingered. Not just for Tony, for everyone. The heroes who had watched Superior Iron Man operate with such chilling efficiency could not unsee what they had seen. The public, already wary after Civil War and the Osborn debacle, added another entry to the long and growing ledger of reasons not to trust Tony Stark with unchecked power, and Tony himself, restored to his full moral capacity, was left with the most disturbing inheritance of all, the knowledge that his inverted self had not been miserable. Superior Iron Man had not been tortured by guilt or plagued by doubt. He had been content, efficient, free. The version of Tony Stark without a conscience had been, by his own metrics, happier than the version with one. That knowledge was a poison more insidious than any bottle, because it meant that every day Tony chose to be good. Every day he wrestled with guilt, with doubt, with the exhausting, endless effort of caring about other people. He was choosing the harder path, not the natural one, the chosen one. Goodness was not Tony Stark's default state. It was his discipline. And the moment that discipline slipped, through exhaustion, through crisis, through the simple human erosion of willpower over time, the Superior was waiting. He was always waiting. The silver armor was destroyed, the app was deleted, the penthouse was emptied. Tony returned to New York, to the workshop, to the familiar hum of the arc reactor and the patient voice of his artificial intelligence, and the ongoing, never-finished project of being a person worth saving. The futurist looked backward for once and did not like what he saw. Every hero is defined by the enemies they cannot escape, not the ones they defeat. Defeat is temporary, a reset button pressed between issues, a pause in an endless war that resumes the moment the page turns. The enemies that define a hero are the ones who reveal something about the hero that the hero does not want to see. The ones who hold up a mirror forged in malice and force the hero to look. Batman has the Joker, chaos reflecting order. Superman has Lex Luthor, power reflecting powerlessness. And Tony Stark has an entire gallery of villains who are, in one way or another, distortions of himself. His greed, his ego, his weapons, his legacy, his intelligence twisted into shapes that are familiar enough to be terrifying and different enough to be monstrous. The Mandarin stands at the apex. He has always stood there. Not because he is the most physically powerful of Tony's enemies, though his power is considerable, but because he represents the most complete philosophical opposition to everything Tony Stark embodies. Tony is the future. The Mandarin is the past. Tony builds. The Mandarin conquers. Tony's power flows from innovation, from laboratories and circuit, boards and the restless, forward-leaning momentum of a mind that cannot stop creating. The Mandarin's power flows from inheritance, from 10 alien rings scavenged from the wreckage of a McLuhan starship that crashed in a Chinese valley centuries ago, artifacts of a civilization so advanced that their technology resembles magic to human eyes. The Mandarin's origin is steeped in the mythology of fallen grandeur. Born to a wealthy family in pre-revolutionary China, he was raised in privilege and educated in the traditions of a dynasty that stretched back generations. When the revolution came, the wealth vanished. The status evaporated. The Mandarin was left with nothing but his intellect, his fury, and an ancestral claim to greatness that the modern world had rendered meaningless. He wandered into the Valley of Spirits, a forbidden region shunned by the local population, and discovered the crashed McLuhan vessel, its alien crew long dead, its technology dormant but intact. The 10 rings lay scattered among the wreckage like jewels from a broken crown. He took them, he learned them, and in the process he became something that transcended the categories of hero and villain entirely. A warlord philosopher, a conqueror mystic, a man who wielded power drawn from the stars and directed it through a worldview forged in the ashes of a civilization's collapse. Each ring possessed a distinct capability: ice blast, fire blast, electrical discharge, magnetic manipulation, matter rearrangement, mental intensification, light emission in blinding, disorienting bursts, the ability to project darkness so absolute it swallowed photons, a disintegration beam that could reduce organic matter to its component atoms, and the vortex beam, a weapon capable of generating winds of hurricane force directed with pinpoint accuracy. Together, the 10 rings made the Mandarin one of the most powerful individual combatants on Earth, a one-man army whose arsenal rivaled Tony's entire suite of armors. But the rings were not what made the Mandarin dangerous. What made him dangerous was his mind, strategic, patient, ruthless, possessed of a long-term vision that measured success not in battles won but in civilizations reshaped. The Mandarin viewed Tony Stark with a contempt that was almost theological in its intensity. To the Mandarin, Tony represented everything wrong with the modern world: the worship of technology over tradition, the elevation of commerce over culture, the American delusion that innovation could substitute for wisdom. Tony built machines. The Mandarin commanded forces that predated human history. Tony's power was manufactured, dependent on supply chains and energy sources and the fragile infrastructure of industrial civilization. The Mandarin's power was personal, inherent, fused to his body and his will in a way that no electromagnetic pulse could disrupt, and no corporate bankruptcy could revoke. Their battles were not merely physical confrontations, they were ideological collisions, two visions of power grinding against each other like tectonic plates, each convinced that the other represented the fundamental error of the age. Tony never fully defeated the Mandarin. That is the truth that lurks beneath decades of confrontations and temporary victories. The Mandarin was stopped, contained, driven back, but never eliminated, never neutralized, never brought to the kind of definitive conclusion that allows a hero to close the chapter and move on. He returned, again and again, each iteration more refined, more dangerous, more convinced that his destiny and Tony's were locked in a cycle that would only end when one of them ceased to exist. The Mandarin was not just a villain, he was a thesis, the argument that technology alone cannot save the world, that progress without roots is merely a more sophisticated form of destruction. Tony's entire life was the counter-argument. Neither side ever conceded. If the Mandarin was Tony's philosophical nemesis, Whiplash was his visceral one. Mark Scarlotti, later succeeded by others who inherited the name and the weapons, was not a genius. He was not a strategist. He was not interested in ideology or the grand sweep of civilizational conflict. Whiplash was a blue-collar villain with a grudge and a pair of electrified whips that could slice through steel like butter. A man whose rage was personal and physical and uncomplicated by the intellectual pretensions that elevated Tony's other enemies to operatic status. He hit hard, he hit fast, and he reminded Tony, with every crackling lash, that not every threat could be outthought. Some had to be outlasted, endured, survived through sheer physical resilience rather than technological superiority. The whips were elegant in their brutality. Titanium filaments charged with enough electrical current to overload Ironman's systems on contact, capable of wrapping around limbs and joints and squeezing until the armour buckled. Whiplash fought at a range that negated many of Ironman's advantages. Too close for missiles, too far for hand-to-hand, a no-man's land of slashing, sparking violence, where the whips controlled the tempo, and Tony was always reacting, always a half-second behind, always aware that one clean strike to the arc reactor could end everything. The fights were ugly, desperate, stripped of the cinematic grandeur that characterized Tony's battles with more powerful foes. Whiplash did not want to conquer the world. He wanted to hurt Tony Stark. And that simplicity of purpose made him, in his own brutal way, one of the most persistent thorns in Iron Man's side. The Ghost operated on an entirely different plane. A corporate saboteur wrapped in a suit that granted intangibility, the ability to phase through solid matter like a spectre passing through walls. The Ghost was born not from personal grudge or alien power, but from the systemic rot of the very industry. Tony Stark dominated. The Ghost's true identity was obscured beneath layers of paranoia and counterintelligence, but the motivation was transparent, anti-capitalism taken to its most extreme and violent conclusion. The Ghost viewed corporations as predatory organisms, parasites feeding on human labour and creativity, and Stark Industries, the largest, most visible, most powerful of them all, was the ultimate target. What made the Ghost terrifying was not the phasing technology, though that alone was formidable enough to render most of Iron Man's weapons useless. It was the intimacy of the threat, The ghost attacked not from outside but from within, infiltrating Stark facilities, sabotaging systems, corrupting data, turning the architecture of Tony's own empire against him. The ghost could walk through vault doors. The ghost could pass through security systems like light through glass. The ghost could stand in Tony's workshop inches away, invisible and intangible, watching and waiting and choosing the perfect moment to strike. Fighting the ghost was like fighting smoke. Every punch passed through empty air, every repulsor blast hit nothing, and the counterattacks came from angles that defied the geometry of physical combat. Tony had to rethink his entire defensive philosophy to counter a threat that could not be contained by walls or armor, or any of the physical barriers that traditional security relied upon. The ghost also forced Tony to confront an uncomfortable truth. The anti-capitalist critique at the heart of the ghost ideology was not entirely wrong. Stark Industries, for all its pivot toward clean energy and humanitarian technology, was still a corporation, still driven by profit, still embedded in systems of exploitation that Tony's personal goodwill could not fully remediate. The ghost was a monster, yes, a terrorist certainly. But the grievance was real, and Tony's inability to fully refute it added a layer of philosophical discomfort to every encounter that made the ghost more than just another villain to be punched into submission. Madame Masque, Whitney Frost, was the wound that never healed. The daughter of Count Nefaria, a Magyar crime lord whose criminal empire stretched across continents, Whitney was raised in the intersection of wealth and corruption, beauty and violence, a woman whose early life was a gilded cage of privilege purchased with blood money. She and Tony were drawn to each other with the gravitational inevitability of two people who recognized in each other the same fundamental damage. The same absent fathers, the same inherited legacies of destruction, the same desperate need to be seen as something other than what their surnames demanded. Their romance was incandescent and doomed. Whitney wore a golden mask, literally a face covering that concealed features scarred in an accident that had stolen the beauty she'd been taught was her only value. The mask became her identity, a barrier between Whitney and a world she no longer trusted to see her as she was. Tony, who wore his own mask of armor and arrogance, understood the impulse better than he wanted to admit. They were mirrors, each reflecting the other's brokenness in ways that were as illuminating as they were destructive. Whitney loved Tony. Tony loved Whitney, and neither of them could save the other, because the forces pulling them apart, Tony's heroism, Whitney's criminal obligations, the fundamental incompatibility of Iron Man and a Magyar princess, were stronger than the forces holding them together. Whitney became Madame Masque, a villain not out of malice but out of inevitability, drawn back into the criminal underworld by loyalty, by obligation, by the inescapable gravity of a family whose business was suffering. She fought Iron Man with weapons and strategies and the specific surgical cruelty of a woman who knew exactly where to cut because she had once been close enough to see the scars. Their battles were laced with grief, each confrontation a reminder of what might have been, each defeat a fresh wound layered over old ones. Madame Masque was not Tony's most powerful enemy. She was his saddest one. Fin Fang Foom was the cosmic absurdity that kept the Marvel Universe honest. A Makluan alien, the same species whose technology powered the Mandarin's rings, trapped in the form of an enormous dragon. Fin Fang Foom was a reminder that the universe Tony inhabited was vast, weird, and fundamentally indifferent to the categories of sense and reason that human minds depended upon. He was a dragon. An actual, fire-breathing, building-sized dragon from outer space. And Tony Stark, the futurist, the rationalist, the man who believed that every problem could be solved with sufficient engineering, had to fight a dragon. The juxtaposition was intentional, almost comic in its extremity. The pinnacle of human technology versus the most ancient and mythological of monsters, science versus legend, the future versus a past so old it preceded history itself. Ezekiel Stain was the future Tony feared, the son of Obadiah, raised in the shadow of his father's defeat, educated with the specific purpose of surpassing the man who had destroyed the Stain legacy. Ezekiel was younger than Tony, arguably smarter, and unburdened by the guilt and moral complexity that slowed Tony's decision-making like sand in gears. Ezekiel did not build suits. He built the technology into his own body, bioweaponry implanted beneath his skin, repulsor nodes embedded in his skeletal structure, energy systems that used his own biological processes as fuel. He was Iron Man without the armor, without the separation between man and machine, without the off switch. He was what Tony might have become if Extremis had been taken to its logical and terrifying conclusion by a mind that viewed the human body not as something to be preserved but as hardware to be optimized. Ezekiel attacked not Tony but Tony's legacy, targeting Stark Industries facilities, Stark Foundation charities, the infrastructure of good works that Tony had built as penance for his father's sins and his own. Every bomb Ezekiel detonated was a message. The Stain name is not finished. The sins of the father are visited upon the son, and the debt owed by the House of Stark to the House of Stain will be collected in blood and fire and the systematic destruction of everything Tony Stark has ever loved. The confrontation between them was generational warfare. The children of Titans fighting a battle that had begun in boardrooms decades before either of them was born, inheriting hatreds they did not choose and could not escape. And then there was Justin Hammer, always Justin Hammer, the persistent, infuriating, unkillable cockroach of Tony's rogues gallery. Hammer was never the most dangerous. He was never the most dramatic. He was simply the most enduring, a man whose mediocrity was his superpower, whose refusal to accept his own limitations fueled a career of scheming and manipulation that outlasted flashier, more powerful villains by decades. Hammer survived because he was useful, to governments that needed deniable weapons, to villains who needed funding, to anyone who wanted Stark-level technology without Stark-level morality. He was the arms dealer Tony used to be, preserved in amber, a walking reminder of the man Tony spent every day trying not to become. Together they formed a constellation of opposition that illuminated Tony from every angle. The Mandarin challenged his philosophy, Whiplash challenged his body, the Ghost challenged his corporate identity, Madame Masque challenged his heart, Fin Fang Foom challenged his rationality, Ezekiel Stain challenged his legacy, and Justin Hammer challenged his ego, the quiet, persistent whisper that Tony Stark was not as special as he believed, that his genius was not unique, that the distance between hero and arms dealer was measured not in moral miles but in a single reversible choice. Tony's villains were not obstacles, they were reflections, and the man who spent his life building armor spent an equal amount of time staring into the mirrors they held up, trying to convince himself that the face looking back was not his own. The argument started with a vision and ended with a body. Ulysses Kane was an inhuman, a young man whose pterogenesis had bestowed upon him a power so vast, so ethically radioactive, that its very existence fractured the superhuman community along fault lines that had barely healed from the last civil war. Ulysses could see the future, not in the vague, prophetic sense of a fortune-teller reading tea leaves. His visions were specific, detailed, actionable predictions of events that had not yet occurred, rendered with enough clarity and accuracy that they could be used to intervene before the predicted catastrophe materialized. He saw a celestial attack before it happened. He saw Thanos arriving on Earth before the mad Titan ship reached the atmosphere. His power was, in theory, the ultimate defensive tool, a crystal ball that could prevent suffering before it began, a weapon against probability itself. Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, saw salvation. If Ulysses could predict threats before they materialized, then the superhuman community had a moral obligation to use that information. Preemptive action, preventive justice, the ability to stop the bomb before it was built, to arrest the killer before the murder, to reshape the future by intervening in the present with the surgical precision that Ulysses' visions made possible. Carol was a soldier. She understood threats. She understood the calculus of risk and response, the cold mathematics of lives saved versus liberties compromised. And in Ulysses, she saw a chance to get ahead of the chaos that had defined their world for decades, to stop reacting and start preventing, to move from defense to something that looked, from certain angles, uncomfortably like preemptive control. Tony saw something else entirely. Tony saw the Superhuman Registration Act with a different name. He saw profiling, not by race or religion, but by probability, by the statistical likelihood of future action, by the predictions of a single individual whose power was not fully understood and whose accuracy was not guaranteed. He saw a system in which people could be arrested, detained, punished for crimes they had not yet committed, based on visions generated by a brain that even its owner could not fully explain. Tony had stood on the other side of this argument once. He had championed registration. He had built the prisons. He had waged a war to enforce a system of accountability that had cost him Steve Rogers' friendship, and ultimately Steve Rogers' life. And the scars of that war, scars that ran deeper than any Extremis could heal, scars that ached, every time Tony looked at a shield-shaped shadow, had taught him something that no amount of genius could have calculated in advance. The road to tyranny is paved with reasonable precautions. He said no. He said it quietly, without the crusading fervour that had characterised his advocacy during the First Civil War. He said it with the weary certainty of a man who had already lived through the consequences of choosing security over liberty, and discovered that the cost was measured not in abstract principles but in the blood of people he loved. Tony Stark, the futurist, the man who had always believed that the next innovation could solve the last problem, looked at Ulysses Kane's power and saw not a solution but a trap, a mechanism for replacing the uncertainty of freedom with the certainty of control, and he knew with every fibre of his battle-scarred being where that road ended. Carol disagreed. The argument escalated, and the superhuman community, barely recovered from the last schism, began to fracture once more. Heroes choosing sides not based on abstract ideology, but on personal experience, on trust, on the specific blend of hope and fear that each individual carried from the scars of wars already fought. Then Rhodey died. It happened during a preemptive strike against Thanos, an operation planned using Ulysses' intelligence, executed with military precision and catastrophic in its outcome. The team intercepted the Mad Titan before he could acquire a cosmic artifact of incalculable power. The ambush worked. The intelligence was accurate. Thanos was exactly where Ulysses said he would be, doing exactly what Ulysses said he would be doing. And it did not matter, because Thanos was Thanos, a being of such overwhelming power that even perfect intelligence could not compensate for the gap between what the heroes could bring to the fight and what the fight demanded. The battle was brief, brutal, and decisive. Thanos was eventually subdued, but the cost was unspeakable. James Rhodes, Rhodey, War Machine, the best friend, the brother, the one constant in Tony Stark's life that had never wavered, never broken, never been compromised by the 1,000 catastrophes that had stripped away everything else, took a blow from Thanos that shattered the War Machine armor like glass and crushed the man inside it. The damage was total. The arc of a life defined by service, by loyalty, by the quiet and unglamorous heroism of showing up every single day. That arc ended in the dirt of a battlefield, in the wreckage of armor Tony had built, in a conflict Tony had tried to prevent, triggered by a power Tony had warned would lead to exactly this kind of tragedy. Tony held him, the way Rhodey had held Tony in the desert years ago, when the first Iron Man armor was smoking wreckage and the future was an unwritten page. Tony held his best friend and felt the weight leave Rhodey's body, felt the absence where the heartbeat had been, felt the specific irreversible silence that separates the living from the dead, and something inside Tony Stark, something that had survived caves and bottles and civil wars and mind wipes and moral inversions, broke in a way that was different from all the other breakings. This was not a fracture that could be repaired. This was not a wound that would scar over. This was an amputation, a removal, a piece of Tony Stark excised from existence with the same finality as the blast that had ended Rhodey's life. The grief became rage. The rage became mission. Tony's opposition to Ulysses' power transformed from philosophical disagreement into personal crusade, the intellectual arguments now fueled by a furnace of loss that burned so hot it consumed nuance, compromise, and the capacity for self-doubt that had always been Tony's most underrated quality. He confronted Carol. He confronted the heroes who supported her. He confronted the system itself, declaring with the absolute conviction of a man who has paid the ultimate price for someone else's certainty that predictive justice was not justice at all. It was fortune-telling with a badge, prophecy with a prison sentence, the abdication of moral agency in favour of algorithmic control. Carol would not yield. She could not yield, not because she was wrong, but because she had seen the vision work. She had seen Thanos intercepted. She had seen threats neutralised before they could metastasize, and she carried her own grief, her own losses, her own tally of friends and civilians who might have been saved if the power to see the future had been available sooner. Carol was not a tyrant. She was a protector, driven by the same impulse that drove Tony, the desperate, all-consuming need to prevent the next tragedy, but arriving at a conclusion that Tony could no longer accept. The Second Civil War did not have the political complexity of the first. It did not have the legislative framework, the institutional infrastructure, the veneer of democratic legitimacy that had made the Registration Act a genuine philosophical dilemma. This war was rawer, more personal, more desperate. Two people who respected each other, who had fought beside each other, who shared the same fundamental desire to protect the world, unable to reconcile their visions of how that protection should work. Tony and Carol circled each other like binary stars, each caught in the other's gravitational pull, each accelerating toward a collision that neither wanted and neither could avoid. The final battle was not in the streets of New York. It was in the sky above the capital, a clash of energy and conviction that lit up the eastern seaboard like a second dawn. Tony in the most advanced armour he had ever built, a synthesis of every innovation, every lesson, every failure and triumph compressed into a suit that represented the absolute pinnacle of what human engineering could achieve. Carol in the full blaze of her cosmic power, a woman whose abilities were not built but born, not manufactured but inherent, a force of nature armoured in nothing but light and will. They fought not as enemies but as former allies who had exhausted every alternative, each blow carrying the weight of arguments unfinished and compromises refused, and a friendship that was dying in real time between them. Tony lost. Not because Carol was right, not because her power was greater, though it was. The gap between human technology and cosmic energy is a chasm that no amount of genius can fully bridge. Tony lost because his body failed. The armour held. The systems held. The technology that Tony had spent his life perfecting did everything it was designed to do. But the man inside, battered by decades of trauma, sustained by an arc reactor that was itself a monument to injury, driven by a grief so total it had consumed the boundaries between mission and self-destruction and could not endure what the armour could. Carol's final blast tore through the suit's defences and struck Tony with a force that the human body, however enhanced, however augmented, however stubbornly sustained by genius and will, simply could not survive. Tony Stark fell from the sky. The armour, shattered and burning, carried him to the ground like a coffin descending into the earth. He did not speak. He did not move. The arc reactor flickered, a heartbeat of blue light growing fainter, dimmer, the pulse of a star collapsing into itself. The heroes gathered around him. Carol stood among them, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with the specific horror of a person who has just done something that cannot be undone. And Tony Stark, the merchant of death, the man in the cave, the drunk, the futurist, the war criminal, the saviour, the most complicated hero the Marvel Universe had ever produced, was placed in a medical coma from which no conventional science could guarantee his return. The world held its breath. Tony Stark was not dead, not technically, not biologically, but the distinction between coma and death is a cold comfort when the mind behind the body is silent, and the machines keeping it alive are humming with an emptiness that sounds, to those who knew him, like a scream. In the absence that followed, legacies bloomed. Riri Williams was 15 years old. She was from Chicago, not the gleaming lakefront of tourist brochures, but the South Side, the neighbourhoods where genius is as common as anywhere else, but opportunity is rationed with a cruelty that passes for policy. Riri was a prodigy in the truest sense, a mind so naturally, effortlessly brilliant that the Massachusetts Institute of Technology had accepted her before she was old enough to drive. She did not know Tony Stark. She had never met him, never worked for him, never been part of the orbit of wealth and technology and superheroic drama that defined his existence. What she had done, alone in a dormitory room with salvaged materials and a scholarship that barely covered textbooks, was reverse engineer an Ironman suit from publicly available data and her own staggering intellect. Tony's artificial intelligence, a digital copy of his consciousness, created before the coma as one of his characteristically paranoid contingencies, found her. The AI was not Tony. It had Tony's voice, Tony's memories, Tony's patterns of thought and speech, but it lacked the warmth of lived experience, the spontaneity of genuine human interaction, the indefinable quality that separates a person from a very sophisticated recording. Still, it guided Riri. It mentored her. It saw in her not a replacement, but a successor, a mind brilliant enough to carry the Ironman legacy forward and young enough to avoid the mistakes that had defined Tony's tenure. Riri became Ironheart. The name was deliberate, a declaration that the legacy she inherited was not about the iron but about the heart, not about the armour but about the person inside it. She was not Tony Stark. She did not carry his guilt, his addiction, his decades of accumulated trauma. She carried her own burdens, the weight of representation, the pressure of genius in a world that did not expect it from someone who looked like her. The loneliness of being the smartest person in every room at an age when most people were still figuring out who they wanted to be.